Hey guys, tonight we begin with the extraordinary life and reign of Eleanor of Aquitaine. The sun-drenched duchess from the south of France who married two kings, outlasted both of them, went on crusade in an age when women were supposed to stay home and pray, led a rebellion against her own husband, survived 16 years of imprisonment, and then at the age of 77 crossed the Pyrenees mountains on horseback to arrange a royal wedding. Because apparently retirement wasn't really on her agenda. She was the most powerful woman of the 12th century. Queen of France. Queen of England. Duchess of Aquitaine for 67 uninterrupted years. Mother of kings. Grandmother of half of Europe. The one woman the medieval world never quite figured out how to contain. And trust me, they tried. So before we go any further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this is genuinely your kind of content. Let me know in the comments where you're joining from and what time it is for you. It is always extraordinary to see the range of people who come here from all over the world to listen to history in the dark. I love that about this channel and I love that about you. Now, dim the lights. Let that fan hum. Maybe pull a blanket a little closer. Because Eleanor of Aquitaine did not have a quiet life, and this is not going to be a quiet story. It just sounds like one. So let's begin. Eleanor's story didn't begin in a cold northern castle surrounded by courtly intrigue and political fog. It began in the warm, golden south of France, in the Duchy of Aquitaine, a land so rich, so vast, so culturally sophisticated that it actually dwarfed the territories of the King of France himself. Think about that for a moment. The French king, the theoretical ruler of the whole country, had less land than Eleanor's father. That's not a duchy. That's an empire with better weather. Eleanor was born in what is now southern France, most likely in the year 1122. She was thoroughly educated by her cultured father, William X, Duke of Aquitaine, versed in literature, philosophy, and languages, and trained to the rigors of court life when she became her father's heir presumptive at just 5 years old. 5. Most children at 5 are worried about dinner. Eleanor was being groomed to inherit one of the largest domains in Europe. Her grandfather was the famous troubadour and warrior William IX, whose works influenced the development of later Provençal Romantic poetry. Her father, while lacking his father's poetic gifts, inherited his love for literature. He encouraged Eleanor and her younger sister in education and cultural refinement. As a young girl, Eleanor was fluent in Latin and adept at all the sports of kings, including hunting and hawking. Now pause and let that settle in. This was the 12th century. A time when women were largely expected to be devout, obedient, and quiet. And Eleanor was being raised to ride horses, read philosophy, speak Latin, understand politics, and run a court. Her childhood wasn't a preparation for marriage. It was a preparation for power. The fact that most of the medieval world would spend decades refusing to accept that is one of history's most spectacular failures of reading the room. In the spring of 1130, her mother and her 4-year-old brother died at the castle of Talmont on Aquitaine's Atlantic coast. Eleanor became heir presumptive at a young age. She was approximately 8 years old when she lost her mother. 8 years old and already carrying a title, a legacy, and a duchy's worth of future responsibility. Most kids at 8 are learning to multiply. Eleanor was learning to lead. She went everywhere with her father, learning at his side. She absorbed his court, his poets, his troubadours, his way of seeing the world as a place where culture and power weren't separate things but the same thing, dressed in different clothes. Aquitaine under the House of Poitiers wasn't just a rich territory. It was a cultural capital. A place where poetry was serious business, where the rules of courtly love were being invented in real time, where ideas moved as freely as wine. And then, abruptly, the idyll ended. Eleanor's childhood came to a sudden end in 1137 when William X died of food poisoning while on a pilgrimage. He died on the road to Santiago de Compostela, a journey of faith that ended in the most unglamorous way imaginable, leaving his 15-year-old daughter alone, unprotected, and in possession of the largest private landholding in France. She was placed under the guardianship of the King of France, and within hours was betrothed to his son and heir, Louis. The king sent an escort of 500 men to convey the news to Eleanor and transport her to her new home. 500 men. To collect one 15-year-old girl. Because that's how valuable she was. Not as a person. As a territory with a pulse. As a duchess who came with land attached. Eleanor had been raised by a father who treated her like a ruler in waiting. And now, overnight, she was a ward of the French crown, her fate being negotiated by men who had decided that what mattered about her was not her mind, her languages, her political education, or the fact that she could probably outride half of them. What mattered was her land. Her hand. And how quickly both could be delivered to a suitable prince. She was 15. She had just lost her father. And she was already the most sought-after woman in Europe. Some people would have crumbled under that weight. Eleanor got on her horse and rode north toward her wedding. On July 25, 1137, Louis and Eleanor were married in the Cathedral of Saint André at Bordeaux in the presence of many lords and church dignitaries. A few days later, they were consecrated Duke and Duchess of Aquitaine at the cathedral at Poitiers. During the banquet that followed, the abbot Suger brought news that the king had died. Young Eleanor was crowned Queen of France on Christmas Day, 1137. So within a single year, she buried her father, gained a husband, lost a king, and gained a crown. All by the age of 15. By the time most medieval noblewomen were nervously entering their first marriage, Eleanor had already managed a duchy, crossed half of France, and become queen of the whole country. On paper, it was everything. In practice, it was a disaster waiting to happen. Eleanor grew up at the majestic, sophisticated, and opulent court in Aquitaine, surrounded by cultured troubadours and poets, as well as well-educated and intelligent southern people of her era. At the same time, young Louis was originally destined for a career in the church while his elder brother Philippe was still alive. His older brother had died in a riding accident, and Louis, who had been raised for the monastery, was suddenly yanked into the role of king. He was pious. He was cautious. He was well-meaning and deeply boring. And he was now married to possibly the most energetic, ambitious, intellectually restless woman in Europe. Louis VII was charmed by his young queen and fell in love with her. Eleanor, however, seems to have never truly reciprocated his feelings. She found her husband boring, overly pious, and rather unmanly. That is the medieval equivalent of describing a marriage as fine. Fine in the way that eating plain bread every day is fine. Technically sufficient. Spiritually defeating. Eleanor discovered soon after their marriage that she was expected to be only Louis's queen consort and the mother of his heirs, playing no role in political life and not even participating in ruling her own lands in Aquitaine. But it wasn't in Eleanor's nature to be a brooding mare and an epitome of a modest and deeply religious queen. Let that sentence breathe for a moment. They expected her to be decorative. She had been raised to be decisive. They wanted a consort. They got a co-ruler who hadn't been informed that this wasn't the arrangement. And she pushed back, loudly, culturally, constantly. Eleanor apparently set about making her court the most splendid in Western Christendom. She filled it with troubadours from southern France and court poets who wrote not only love songs but epic chansons de geste, songs of great deeds. She imported the warmth and creativity of her homeland into the austere grey formality of the French court and watched the French courtiers quietly lose their minds about it. The French courtiers cringed at the attempts of their new queen to change their life. The ideas of courtly love and troubadour songs shocked the conservative northern court. For some time they tolerated it, but Louis VII was slowly growing to dislike Eleanor's behavior. And there's your marriage in miniature. One partner trying to fill the house with music and poetry and color. The other partner turning it down and calling in the priests. Two people who spoke entirely different languages, except Eleanor actually spoke 5 and Louis couldn't keep up with any of them. They produced 2 daughters. No sons. And in the 12th century, that single fact could undo everything. In 1147, Louis VII decided to take the cross and join the Second Crusade to the Holy Land. A military pilgrimage. A mission of faith and glory. A deeply ill-advised military expedition that would go spectacularly wrong. And Eleanor decided she was coming too. Eleanor persuaded Louis to allow her and her ladies to accompany him, which was unheard of at the time. Not just unheard of. Genuinely scandalous. Queens did not go on crusade. Noble ladies certainly didn't. War was a man's domain, a sweaty, violent, gloriously masculine pursuit that women were supposed to wait at home praying about. Eleanor ignored this expectation completely and packed her ladies, her household, her cultural sensibility, and what contemporary chroniclers described with barely concealed horror as her enormous baggage train. Because why march to the Holy Land when you could march to the Holy Land in style? The crusade was, by any military measurement, an absolute failure. The Christian forces were defeated at Damascus. The morale was catastrophic. The command decisions were confused and disorganized. And in the middle of all this military chaos, Eleanor arrived at Antioch. Her uncle, Raymond of Antioch, welcomed her warmly. Extremely warmly. Perhaps too warmly, depending on which medieval chronicler you trusted, and most of them had opinions sharper than their accuracy. Eleanor's uncle Raymond of Antioch welcomed Eleanor and lavished such attention on her that rumors arose of an affair. Despite a lack of concrete evidence, Eleanor spent most of the crusade under close guard on her husband's orders. There it is. The scandal that historians still argue about 9 centuries later. Was it an affair? Was it a political disagreement? Was Raymond simply lobbying Eleanor to convince Louis to support his military ambitions in the region and Louis misread affection for conspiracy? The honest historical answer is we genuinely do not know. Eleanor never told us. Raymond is dead. Louis's chroniclers were not exactly neutral observers. What we do know is this. Eleanor asked Louis for an annulment in Antioch. Openly. On crusade. In front of witnesses. Which either tells you everything about the state of their marriage or everything about Eleanor's extraordinary comfort with confrontation. Or both. Probably both. Louis refused. He had Eleanor physically removed from the city under cover of darkness. She reportedly wept and screamed as they dragged her away. Witnesses reported it. Chroniclers wrote it down. And then they spent the next 5 centuries arguing about what it meant. Louis's jealousy over her behavior caused him to annul their marriage in 1152, after 15 years as Queen of France. Feudal custom worked to her advantage, and she retained possession of Aquitaine, roughly 1/3 of France at the time. 1/3 of France. She walked away from 15 years of an unsatisfying marriage and kept 1/3 of France. While he kept the crown and she kept the land. And the land, as any medieval accountant would have quietly noted, was arguably the better deal. She was 30 years old, newly single, scandalously famous, and in possession of more territory than the King of France's remaining holdings. Which, if you think about it, is a pretty remarkable position to be in after a divorce. By May 1152, Eleanor was married again, to the man who would become her first husband's greatest rival. Henry of Anjou became King of England in 1154 and eventually built an empire that extended 1,000 miles, from Scotland in the north to the Pyrenees in the south. She didn't waste time, did she? 6 weeks. 6 weeks after her annulment from the King of France, Eleanor of Aquitaine was married to Henry Plantagenet, 11 years younger than her, volcanic in temperament, ferociously intelligent, and quite possibly the most energetic human being in 12th century Europe. He couldn't sit still. He ate standing up. He made law while riding horses. He ran an empire the way a force of nature runs a coastline, relentlessly, without stopping, reshaping everything it touched. And Eleanor matched him. Almost. Together, they built the Angevin Empire, the most formidable political entity in Western Europe. Eleanor bore Henry 8 children, including the future Richard I and John. She was no passive consort. She governed territories in Henry's absence, issued charters, and exercised real political authority. 8 children. An empire stretching from the Scottish border to southern France. Governance on both sides of the Channel. Eleanor wasn't just Henry's wife. She was his co-administrator, his political counterpart, his partner in building one of the most powerful dynasties in European history. She issued legal documents. She made political decisions. She ran England while Henry was in France and ran France while Henry was in England. The empire didn't function without her. But then came Rosamund. Henry's famous temper and impulsive nature did nothing to help the relationship, and his transparency regarding his affair with the noblewoman Rosamund Clifford seemed designed to humiliate his queen. Rosamund Clifford. Known to history and legend as Fair Rosamund. The Rose of the World. A young woman of considerable beauty who caught the very wandering eye of Henry II and whom he seems to have housed at his palace of Woodstock in Oxfordshire with zero attempt at discretion. The legends that grew up around this affair are magnificent and almost entirely invented. The most famous tale holds that Henry hid his mistress in a maze at Woodstock, and that Eleanor, with the help of a silken thread, tracked Rosamund down and forced her to choose between a dagger and a poison cup. Almost none of it is true. The labyrinth, the thread, the poison cup, these details only appear in chronicles and ballads written long after Rosamund's death. There is zero evidence that Eleanor and Rosamund ever met at all. Zero evidence. But what a story. What a magnificently dramatic story that people kept telling and embellishing and passing down for centuries because it was exactly the story people needed Eleanor to be. A vengeful, jealous queen. A scorned woman driven to murder. Because the alternative, a politically brilliant woman who had built an empire and was now methodically working out how to defend her own power, was apparently less interesting than poison and a labyrinth. Eleanor was smarter than the legend. She always was. Eleanor endured her marriage in typical fashion by channeling her energies elsewhere and raising her children, through whom she knew she could eventually wield greater power and influence than through Henry himself, through advantageous matches. She played the long game. Henry had his mistresses and his tantrums and his ceaseless movement across the empire. Eleanor raised her children. Educated them. Nurtured relationships with them. Understood, with the clear strategic intelligence of someone who had been thinking about power since she was 5 years old, that the future of her influence wasn't in Henry's bed. It was in her children's thrones. And when the moment came to act on that understanding, she did not hesitate. It is during the 1160s and 1170s that Eleanor's cultural legacy reaches its zenith. Establishing her court at Poitiers, she created what historians have called the most brilliant cultural salon of the medieval world. Here, surrounded by her daughter Marie de Champagne and a circle of poets, musicians, and intellectuals, Eleanor presided over a revolution in European letters. Her court at Poitiers was Eleanor at her most herself. No Louis to disapprove of the troubadours. No Henry to storm through the hall and rearrange everyone's priorities. Just Eleanor, her daughters, her poets, her ideas, and the extraordinary cultural ferment of a woman who had spent decades ruling other people's courts now finally ruling her own. The concept of courtly love, that whole magnificent medieval framework of romantic devotion and chivalric behavior, was shaped in large part by what happened at Eleanor's court in Poitiers. She didn't just patronize culture. She created the conditions in which culture transformed itself. And then she picked up a sword. Metaphorically. But effectively. The revolt of her sons against her husband in 1173 put her cultural activities to a brutal end. Since Eleanor, 11 years her husband's senior, had long resented his infidelities, the revolt may have been instigated by her. In any case, she gave her sons considerable military support. Let us understand what Eleanor did in 1173. She organized, or at minimum enthusiastically supported and militarily funded, a rebellion of her own sons against their father, the King of England, one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. This was not passive dissent. This was active political insurrection. This was Eleanor deciding that Henry had gone far enough and that the vehicle for her revenge and her son's futures was a full-scale military uprising. Eleanor rallied her barons in Poitou to the cause of her sons. When the rebellion failed, Henry accepted the submission of his sons. Eleanor, who was captured as she rode toward safety in France, was not so fortunate. While sons rebelling against their father could be seen as boys flexing their muscles, for a wife to rebel against her husband was practically unheard of, and therefore deserved harsher punishment. She was captured on the road to France. Some accounts say she was dressed in men's clothing, attempting to disguise herself as a knight. If true, and the historical sources lean toward it, then in the final moments of her rebellion Eleanor of Aquitaine rode toward freedom in men's clothes like the protagonist of the kind of story that wasn't supposed to exist about women in the 12th century. Henry II captured Eleanor and imprisoned her for almost 16 years at various locations, including Old Sarum in Wiltshire. It seems she was kept in some comfort, fine clothes for Eleanor and her household. 16 years. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France, Queen of England, Duchess of Aquitaine, the most formidable political mind of her generation, spent 16 years as a prisoner of her own husband in the English countryside. She was roughly 50 years old when it began. She would be in her mid-60s before it ended. And here is the thing that history keeps trying to tell us about Eleanor, the thing that makes her genuinely extraordinary. The imprisonment didn't break her. It didn't dim her. It didn't turn her into a cautionary tale. It just meant that Eleanor of Aquitaine spent 16 years waiting, watching, and planning, which was, if you had been paying attention to her life at all, exactly what she was best at. Henry II died in July 1189 and their son Richard succeeded him. One of Richard's first acts was to free his mother from prison and restore her to full freedom. 67 years old. She walked out of 16 years of imprisonment at 67 years old and immediately began working. No recovery period. No quiet retirement. No graceful stepping back from the stage of history. After her years of house arrest, she threw herself into preparing for the coronation of her son Richard. Before he was crowned King of England, she journeyed all over his future kingdom to forge alliances and foster goodwill. She basically ran Richard's coronation campaign. At 67. After 16 years in captivity. When Richard set out on the Third Crusade, Eleanor took charge as regent, fending off her power-hungry son John. She even paid Richard's ransom when he was imprisoned by the Duke of Austria and the Holy Roman Emperor, traveling there herself to bring him home to England. Traveling there herself. Eleanor of Aquitaine, in her early 70s, crossed the Alps in winter to personally escort her son home from captivity in the Holy Roman Empire. Because if you want something done, apparently you do it yourself, regardless of your age, the season, or the height of the mountain range between you and your objectives. When Richard was captured and held for ransom, Eleanor marshaled the resources to secure his release, famously writing anguished letters to Pope Celestine III demanding intervention. "I am wasted with torment," she wrote. "My bones cling to my skin." That letter. Read it again. "My bones cling to my skin." A woman in her 70s writing to the Pope in Latin, in terms that were simultaneously a personal cry of grief and a calculated political demand. She knew exactly what she was doing with that language. She was making herself a figure of maternal tragedy, because maternal tragedy was the one register that even a pope might respond to. She weaponized her own sorrow. As she had weaponized everything else in her life. With absolute precision. After Richard's death in 1199, Eleanor supported the succession of her youngest son John, traveling across the Pyrenees at the age of 77 to fetch her granddaughter Blanche of Castile, who would marry the future Louis VIII of France and eventually become one of the most powerful regents in French history. 77 years old. The Pyrenees Mountains. In the Middle Ages. On horseback. To arrange a marriage that would shape the political future of France for the next generation. Eleanor of Aquitaine was 77 years old and still actively shaping the destiny of nations like it was a Tuesday afternoon and she had nothing better to do. In 1200, when she was nearly 80 years old, Eleanor helped defend Anjou and Aquitaine against her rebel grandson, Arthur of Brittany. Nearly 80. Defending territories from a military siege. A great-grandmother on the walls of medieval Europe, absolutely refusing to be finished. Eleanor of Aquitaine died in 1204 at the Abbey of Fontevraud, where she was buried alongside Henry II and Richard the Lionheart. She was approximately 82 years old, a life of astonishing length and scope. She outlived Henry. She outlived Richard. She outlived most of the people who had tried to define her, contain her, marry her off, lock her up, or dismiss her. The nuns of the monastery at Fontevraud wrote in their records after her death that she was a queen who surpassed almost all the queens of the world. Not a bad epitaph. Though honestly, for Eleanor, it probably still felt a little understated. Here is what Eleanor of Aquitaine was, in the cold, clear light of what the evidence actually shows us. She was a ruler. Not a consort. Not a political accessory. A ruler who governed, issued charters, administered territories, negotiated diplomacy, and exercised genuine executive authority across 2 kingdoms and one of the largest duchies in Europe. She has been misjudged by many historians who noted only her youthful frivolity, ignoring the tenacity, political wisdom, and energy that characterized the years of her maturity. She was a cultural architect. Throughout her marriage to Louis VII, Eleanor filled her court with poets and artists. When she set up her own court at Poitiers, she again surrounded herself with artists. There is no doubt that she inspired the works of Bernard de Ventadour and, through her daughter Marie, inspired the greatest and most influential works of courtly love literature. The tradition of courtly love, that enormous shaping force on European literature, music, and concepts of romance that echoed down through the Renaissance and beyond, runs in a direct line through Eleanor's patronage and her courts. She was a survivor. During the last 15 years of her life, Eleanor displayed extraordinary abilities as a ruler. Richard spent most of his time away on crusade, and Eleanor acted as vice-regent. She remained closely involved in the affairs of Aquitaine until her death at the age of 82 in 1204, maintaining her role as one of the most influential and revered people of medieval Europe. And she was, by the only honest measure available, a woman who made the medieval world considerably bigger simply by refusing to fit inside the space it had assigned her. 2 crowns. 1 duchy, held for 67 years. 2 crusades. 16 years imprisonment. A regent for kings. A grandmother of nations. A woman who crossed the Pyrenees at 77 and was still defending castles at nearly 80. The medieval world had a very clear idea of what a woman was supposed to be. Quiet. Obedient. Decorative. Pious. Maternal in the passive sense. Present without being powerful. Eleanor of Aquitaine was none of those things. And the world is measurably richer for it. Now here's the part where Eleanor of Aquitaine stops being the quietly brilliant political strategist in the corner of a miserable French court and becomes something altogether more interesting. A woman on a military expedition to the Holy Land. In the 12th century. On horseback. With opinions. And the medieval world collectively lost its mind about it. Let us set the scene. The year is 1144. Far away in the east, the county of Edessa, one of the Christian Crusader states carved out of the First Crusade, has fallen to the Muslim forces of Zengi, a powerful Turkic warlord with ambitions that extended considerably further than anyone in Western Europe had been paying attention to. The news arrived in Europe like a cold shock of water. Edessa was gone. The fragile Christian foothold in the Holy Land was unraveling. And someone needed to do something dramatic and expensive about it. Enter Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard's powers of persuasion were almost mystical. He managed to persuade important people to raise armies for this cause against all odds. People believed that they would be rewarded by God for their service. He preached. He traveled. He made the kind of speeches that made grown kings weep and then immediately sign up for military campaigns that any reasonable person might have talked them out of. He convinced Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany to lead what would become the Second Crusade. And Eleanor decided she was going too. Eleanor persuaded Louis to allow her and her ladies to accompany him, which was unheard of at the time. Not merely unusual. Not simply eyebrow-raising. Unheard of. Queens did not go to war. Queens did not march across Europe, sail the Mediterranean, and insert themselves into military campaigns being run by men who already had enough trouble managing the campaign without also managing their wives' travel logistics. The crusade was a man's world in the most total and absolute sense that medieval Europe could construct. And Eleanor looked at that world, looked at the alternative, staying behind in Paris, being devout, being patient, being quiet, and said, effectively, "No thank you, I'll come along." Some accounts say she brought ladies of her court with her. The romantic version of this story features 300 noblewomen dressed as Amazons, riding out in gleaming armor to join the Holy War. That particular image is almost certainly a medieval embellishment that history kept alive because it was too magnificent to abandon. Female participation was likely much smaller during the Second Crusade than has been suggested. But even if Eleanor brought only herself and a reasonable household, the statement was the same. She was going. And nobody was going to make her stay. The journey east was, from the first mile, a study in how not to run a military campaign. The German and French armies took separate routes to Anatolia, fighting skirmishes along the way, and both were defeated separately by the Seljuk Turks. Conrad's Germans went first and managed to lose the vast majority of their force to Turkish horse archers in the mountains near Dorylaeum. The Germans, unfamiliar with such tactics and exhausted by the terrain, panicked and fled. Many died in battle, and others drowned trying to escape through narrow passes and fast-moving rivers. The shattered remains of the army, estimated to have lost up to 90% of its strength, retreated to Nicaea. 90% of their army. Gone before they had even seen Jerusalem. Louis and the French did marginally better, which is to say they survived the crossing of Anatolia, but only barely. The French were beaten badly in battle as they crossed the Cadmus Mountains on January 7, 1148. Men died in the mountain passes. The army was battered, cold, hungry, and demoralized. The Grand Crusade that Bernard of Clairvaux had preached with such magnificent conviction was, within months of leaving France, already looking like a catastrophic idea with excellent marketing. And in the middle of all of this, the two royal armies straggled south toward the coast, and eventually, finally, gratefully, arrived at Antioch. Now, Antioch. We need to talk about Antioch. The city in March of 1148 was ruled by Raymond of Poitiers, Prince of Antioch. Raymond was Eleanor's paternal uncle. His parents were William IX, Duke of Aquitaine, and his second wife Philippa. His older brother William was destined to become Duke of Aquitaine and father of Eleanor herself, but there was no inheritance for young Raymond, and he left Aquitaine to seek his fortune. He'd gone east, carved out a principality for himself, and now ruled one of the most strategically important Christian cities in the Holy Land with a combination of military cunning, political instinct, and the kind of charm that, according to contemporary accounts, made everyone who met him considerably more likely to do what he wanted. Although not literate himself, he fostered those who were and enjoyed culture. He liked gambling and was known to be impetuous and hot-tempered, but he also had a high reputation for gallantry. In other words, Raymond was Eleanor's grandfather's son, through and through. Loud, charismatic, culturally alive, fond of a good time, and possessed of the kind of forceful personality that fills a room the moment it enters. And Eleanor, who had spent the last decade trapped in a marriage to a man she found boring, overly pious, and fundamentally unequal to her energy, walked into Antioch and immediately felt at home. During the Second Crusade, the French army spent only 10 days in her uncle's city, but a great scandal began there that followed Eleanor for the rest of her life, a scandal that continued to plague her even once she had left Louis VII far behind to become Queen of the English. 10 days. The entire scandal that historians have been arguing about for 900 years unfolded in 10 days in a city in what is now southern Turkey. Let that temporal scale wash over you for a moment. Here is what we actually know. Eleanor and Raymond spent time together. They were family. They clearly enjoyed each other's company with the particular warmth of two southern people, raised in the same cultural tradition of troubadours and poetry and the sophisticated courts of Aquitaine, who had both been transplanted to colder, duller, more religiously severe environments and were now standing together in the closest thing either of them had to home. Raymond had a military problem. Raymond seemed to hope that Eleanor would be able to influence Louis and persuade him to campaign with him in assaulting the city of Aleppo, which was the greatest threat to Antioch's security. He needed the French army's help. He needed Louis to stay and fight locally rather than marching his troops off toward Jerusalem. And Eleanor, who agreed with Raymond's military logic and who was never in her life afraid to say so, supported her uncle's position openly. Loudly. In front of witnesses. Against her husband's stated decision. The scandal that many scholars can agree upon is the fact that Eleanor spoke out against her husband, which was behavior not befitting a wife or a queen. Eleanor was engaging in, as John of Salisbury described it, a form of deliberate provocation, a will to manifest her independence, that the clerics interpreted as infidelity, whether or not it amounted to outright adultery. There it is, buried in plain sight. For the medieval clerical establishment, Eleanor openly disagreeing with her husband in public was already the moral equivalent of adultery. The scandal didn't actually require an affair. It only required Eleanor behaving, in John of Salisbury's remarkable phrase, as a man, even as a king. She had the audacity to have a political opinion that contradicted her husband's. In the 12th century, that was apparently scandal enough. But the chroniclers, being chroniclers, didn't stop at political disagreement. The story says that Eleanor and Raymond became lovers while pious King Louis was out praying at every shrine he could find. The cuckolded husband, upon discovering Eleanor and Raymond, dragged his wife out of the castle in the dead of night, threatening to raze the city to the ground if Eleanor did not leave at once. That version. That lurid, detailed, dramatically satisfying version of events spread across Europe like fire through dry parchment. An incestuous affair with her own uncle. A jealous king. A midnight abduction. It had everything a medieval scandal needed except a dragon, and frankly several chroniclers were probably working on adding one. The evidence for the affair, examined honestly, is close to non-existent. Raymond was by all accounts a faithful husband to his wife Constance. Eleanor was under intense political scrutiny every moment of her time in Antioch. The 10 days they spent there were watched, noted, and reported on by multiple parties with competing agendas. And yet, nothing concrete. No witness. No letter. No confession. Nothing that rises above the level of he seemed very friendly and she laughed at his jokes and that is probably suspicious. What we do know happened is this. Louis VII had decided he wanted to go directly to Jerusalem rather than campaigning for Raymond in the north. Raymond and Eleanor both disagreed. When Louis would not change his position, Eleanor told her husband plainly that she would not go with him, but instead remain in Antioch. She said it out loud. To her husband. In public. In a foreign city. While on a religious military expedition blessed by the Pope. Louis's response to this was not negotiation. Louis, who adored his wife but would not leave her behind, had Eleanor physically removed from Antioch. She reportedly wept and screamed as they dragged her away. Not exactly a romantic resolution. Not the portrait of a devoted couple working through their differences with patience and mutual respect. Louis had Eleanor forcibly removed from a city she didn't want to leave, in the middle of the night, under armed escort, like a prisoner rather than a queen. And having witnessed her husband do this. Having felt the physical reality of what happened when she exercised her own judgment and he overruled it with force. Eleanor of Aquitaine quietly filed that information away. In the same part of her mind where she kept everything important. And she didn't forget it. The mere fact that the rumor was possible meant that Eleanor had displeased God in some way, and he was expressing his disapproval by causing the failure of the crusade. That's how the chroniclers framed it. The Second Crusade failed not because of bad military strategy, not because of the division between the German and French armies, not because of the catastrophically ill-chosen decision to attack Damascus rather than pursue the original objective of Edessa, but because Eleanor of Aquitaine had misbehaved in Antioch. A woman's conduct had brought divine judgment down upon an entire international military campaign. Which tells you considerably more about how medieval men thought about women than it tells you about Eleanor. The siege of Damascus in 1148 was the final act of the Second Crusade. Lasting a mere 4 days from July 24 to July 28, the siege by a combined Western European army was not successful, and the crusade petered out with its leaders returning home more bitter and angry with each other than with the Muslim enemy. Rather than targeting Aleppo or attempting a recovery of Edessa, the leaders chose to march against Damascus. Local barons questioned the wisdom of attacking a former ally and doubted whether the city could be held even if captured. The decision showed a fatal misunderstanding of the region's politics and indicated that the Crusades' leaders lacked both knowledge and flexibility. 4 days. They besieged Damascus for 4 days, made a series of baffling tactical decisions that even their own allies questioned in real time, and then gave up and went home. They found their way back to Jerusalem after only 4 days of siege, intensely humiliated. The Second Crusade, launched with such extraordinary fanfare, blessed by the Pope, preached by the most powerful orator in Europe, funded by the largest kingdoms on the continent, ended not with glory and Jerusalem ringing with Christian celebration but with 2 exhausted kings sailing home defeated, having accomplished precisely nothing except killing a great many people and making the situation in the Holy Land considerably worse. Bernard of Clairvaux, who had preached the whole enterprise into existence, was reportedly devastated. He received his share of criticisms throughout Europe for the failed undertaking. Louis VII and Conrad III were heavily condemned for their poor coordination and weak strategies. But in the popular imagination, the person most blamed for the failure was not the king who made the tactical decisions, not the German emperor who had lost 90% of his force before reaching the Holy Land, not the local Christian barons who pushed for the catastrophic decision to attack Damascus. The person most blamed was Eleanor. Because she had been in Antioch. Because she had talked to her uncle. Because she had dared to disagree with her husband. Because a woman with opinions was a far more satisfying villain than the military incompetence of 2 kings and the structural dysfunction of an entire crusading enterprise. That's how it works. Then and now. The woman in the room takes the blame for the thing the men got wrong. The journey home was its own particular misery. Sailing across the Mediterranean, Louis and Eleanor traveled in separate ships, which tells you everything you need to know about the state of their marriage without a single word of explanation. They were reunited in September 1149 and given a magnificent reception at Potenza by King Roger of Sicily. From Sicily, they visited Pope Eugenius III at Tusculum. And here the story takes a turn so improbable that if you found it in a novel you would close the book and set it aside on the grounds of narrative implausibility. The Pope, fully informed by advisors about the crisis in the royal marriage, the alleged scandal in Antioch, the separate ships, the complete breakdown of whatever warmth had once existed between Louis and Eleanor, decided that the solution was interior decoration. Eugenius went so far as to insist that they sleep together in a bed which he had personally blessed. The Pope arranged a romantic bedroom and personally blessed the bed for the King of France and his deeply unhappy wife, as a diplomatic solution to a marital crisis that had scandalized the entire crusade. This is what passes for marriage counseling in the 12th century. Some temporary reconciliation must have been achieved, as Eleanor was pregnant by the time they returned to France. His efforts were partially effective, but she produced another girl, Alex. Another daughter. Louis needed a son. Eleanor had now produced 2 daughters across 15 years of marriage. With no male issue and facing substantial opposition to Eleanor from many of his barons, Louis bowed to Eleanor's desire for divorce. On the 11th of March, 1152, Eleanor and Louis met at the royal castle at Beaugency to dissolve their marriage. Presided over by the Archbishop of Senators, the annulment was granted on the grounds of consanguinity within the 4th degree. Eleanor and Louis were third cousins. Their daughters were declared legitimate, custody was awarded to Louis, and Eleanor's lands were restored to her. 1/3 of France returned to her. Because in all the fog of scandal and rumor and papal bedroom diplomacy and military catastrophe, the one thing that feudal law protected with absolute clarity was Eleanor's right to her own duchy. She came in with Aquitaine. She left with Aquitaine. Louis kept his crown and his daughters and his reputation as a pious, mildly incompetent king who had once gone on crusade and come back with less than he started with. Eleanor kept the land. Eleanor raced back to Aquitaine, escaping several attempts on the road to capture her and force her into marriage. Because that was the other thing about being the most eligible woman in Europe with 1/3 of France attached to her name, the moment the ink dried on her annulment, every ambitious nobleman between Paris and the Pyrenees was calculating how to get her to the altar before someone else did. 2 separate lords attempted to ambush her on the road home, both hoping to force a marriage that would hand them Aquitaine. Eleanor outran them both. She arrived home free, 30 years old, twice almost kidnapped, fresh off the most scandalous crusade in European history, carrying a reputation that medieval chroniclers would spend decades gleefully blackening, and in possession of more land than the king she had just divorced. And 6 weeks later, she was engaged again. This time to a man 11 years younger than her, built like a storm system, possessed of an empire that would reshape European history, and with absolutely no capacity for sitting still. 6 weeks. That's how long Eleanor of Aquitaine waited between annulling one marriage and beginning another. 6 weeks between closing the door on 15 years as Queen of France and opening the door to what would become 37 years as the most consequential woman in the Angevin world. 6 weeks between Louis, the pious and essentially decent man she had outgrown before the ink was dry on their wedding contract, and Henry, who was something else entirely. 2 more strong-minded, forceful, and determined people could hardly have been matched. Eleanor, who was about 30, had already been Queen of France for 15 years. She was beautiful, sophisticated, highly intelligent, and accustomed to having her own way. Henry was 19, bull-necked, stocky, and freckled, a man of electric energy and ferocious impatience, compelling charm, and an ungovernable temper. He was ruthless when crossed. Let that physical description breathe for a moment. Bull-necked. Stocky. Freckled. This was not the medieval ideal of a romantic hero. Henry II was not the kind of man troubadours wrote delicate love songs about. He was the kind of man who made things happen by the sheer terrifying force of his presence in a room. He didn't walk into buildings so much as collide with them. He was famous for rolling on the floor and chewing the straw when in a fury. He governed like a man twice his age. He was sharp, tireless, and famously short-tempered. He was, in other words, exactly nothing like Louis VII. And Eleanor, who had spent 15 years married to a man who found her exhausting, recognized something in Henry that she hadn't felt since childhood. She recognized an equal. Someone who matched her energy without being threatened by it. Someone who wanted power as instinctively and as naturally as she did, who understood that the world was a chessboard and not a prayer book. Someone who would not suggest she be quieter, more modest, less present. For about 13 years, it worked magnificently. While Eleanor was still married to Louis, she began secret negotiations with Henry to become his wife upon the dissolution of her marriage. It was a bold and unprecedented move for a sitting queen to arrange her own remarriage, especially to a rival of her husband. But Eleanor was determined to secure her own future and that of Aquitaine. Read that again slowly. Eleanor of Aquitaine arranged her own second marriage while still technically married to her first husband. Negotiated it directly. Chose her own partner. Did not wait for a guardian or a liege lord or a pope to tell her who to marry next. She identified the match she wanted, initiated the conversation, and had the agreement in place before the annulment was even finalized. In the 12th century, when women were legally defined as property of their male relatives, the French king, while no longer her husband, was still nominally her liege lord and should have found a new husband for her, or at least have had final approval over her choice. Eleanor had different ideas. On May 18, 1152, just 6 weeks after her divorce was finalized, she married a man 12 years her junior, a man whom her ex thoroughly disapproved of. Henry Plantagenet was a thorn in France's side and the last man Louis would have chosen as a partner for Eleanor. Louis's reaction to this news was reportedly incandescent. He had just spent 15 years married to the most difficult woman in Europe and had finally, with enormous relief and considerable help from the Pope, got himself free. And then Eleanor immediately married his most dangerous political rival and combined her enormous territorial holdings with Henry's considerable ones, creating a power block in western France that made Louis look, comparatively, like a man with a garden and some ambitions. Contemporary chroniclers were shocked at the haste and audacity of the match. They needn't have been surprised. This was Eleanor operating at her most fundamentally herself. Swift. Strategic. Unapologetic. And always playing the longer game than the people watching her. Henry II was formally crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey on December 19, 1154, alongside his queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine. The ceremony symbolized the restoration of stronger royal authority after years of disorder. Henry inherited and ruled over a vast collection of lands, later called the Angevin Empire, stretching across England and large parts of France, and his coronation signaled a new phase of energetic government, legal reform, and military consolidation. The Angevin Empire. The name historians gave to what Henry and Eleanor built together. Henry II ruled as King of England, Count of Anjou, Duke of Normandy, Duke of Aquitaine, Duke of Gascony, Count of Nantes, Lord of Ireland, and at various times controlled parts of Wales, Scotland, and western France. His territories stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees Mountains in the south of France. 1,000 miles. Held together not by bureaucracy or railway lines or any of the mechanisms of empire we recognize today, but by constant, relentless, physically exhausting movement. Henry II governed his empire on horseback. He crossed the Channel so many times in so many directions that his court had no fixed location. The palace was wherever Henry currently was, which was never the same place twice in a row. The Angevin Empire was a mosaic of duchies and counties, bound by loyalty, family, and sheer force of personality. And into this mosaic, Eleanor inserted herself with both hands. Not as an observer. Not as a decorative consort. She was no passive queen. She governed territories in Henry's absence, issued charters, and exercised real political authority. Eleanor frequently administered justice in Henry's absence, arbitrating in disputes over land and feudal dues, presiding over law courts, keeping careful watch over certain tax receipts. Throughout she showed herself clear-headed and firm, indeed dictatorial. Dictatorial. That word, used admiringly or at least matter-of-factly by the chronicler who observed it. Eleanor of Aquitaine was dictatorial in the exercise of her administrative duties. She didn't suggest. She decided. She didn't ask. She ruled. And the Angevin Empire, for the first 13 years of the reign, needed exactly that. Henry was always somewhere else. Eleanor was holding the back half of the empire together by the force of her judgment and the volume of her charters. She was named regent multiple times during Henry II campaigns in France. She held enormous power in both England and Aquitaine, issued charters, managed royal business, and oversaw governance. This is the Eleanor that history has sometimes misplaced in favor of the scandal. The administrator. The legal operator. The woman who sat in English courts in her husband's absence and made binding decisions about land, money, inheritance, and dispute, while simultaneously managing corresponding legal and political business in Aquitaine and keeping enough threads in hand that the whole enormous enterprise didn't unravel when Henry rode off to deal with the next crisis in the next corner of the next duchy. She was doing 2 jobs at once. In 2 countries. In 2 languages. While pregnant. Because there was also the small matter of building a dynasty. To her new husband Eleanor bore 5 sons and 3 daughters. The sons were William, who died at the age of 3, Henry, Richard the Lionheart, Geoffrey, Duke of Brittany, and John, surnamed Lackland until, having outlived all his brothers, he inherited in 1199 the crown of England. The daughters were Matilda, who married Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony and Bavaria, Eleanor, who married Alfonso VIII, King of Castile, and Joan, who married successively William II, King of Sicily, and Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse. Count them. 8 children. 2 sons who became kings of England. 3 daughters who became queens. Every child placed, married, positioned on the map of European power like pieces on a chessboard. Eleanor would eventually be called the grandmother of Europe, and it is not a metaphor. Through her children's marriages, her bloodline ran through the royal houses of England, France, Castile, Sicily, Saxony, and beyond. The woman who started life as a duchess in southwestern France ended it as the dynastic root of half of Europe's royal families. Eleanor's relationship with her children by Henry showed a woman very emotionally invested in her offspring. She kept them with her when they were young and took particular interest in their futures. One such favorite was the 4th child, Richard, born on September 8, 1157. Richard. The one she loved best, if the historical record is any guide. The one who would become Richard the Lionheart, the greatest military name of the age, the king who went on crusade and got himself captured and needed his mother to cross half of Europe in her 70s to bring him home. Eleanor saw in Richard what she perhaps recognized from looking in the mirror, someone too large for their circumstances, too driven for the roles the world had assigned them, someone who would make history whether history wanted to accommodate them or not. She raised her sons, educated them, placed them, and quietly, steadily, built the network of loyalty and relationship that would eventually matter more than anything Henry could create by conquest. The popularity of the royal couple was linked to the ancient prophecies of Merlin, famous in Europe in the 12th century. Eleanor was thought to be the eagle, the broken covenant was the dissolution of her marriage to Louis, and the 3rd nesting was thought to be the birth of her 3rd son, Richard, who would later be king. The eagle of the broken covenant shall rejoice in her 3rd nesting. Medieval people applied that prophecy to Eleanor and Richard, and the image stuck. An eagle. Not a dove. Not a swan, the usual poetic choice for noble queens. An eagle. A bird of prey with talons and a 1,000-yard view. Someone who watches from a height and strikes with precision. If you were going to pick one bird for Eleanor of Aquitaine, that is, honestly, the correct bird. But the empire had cracks. And some of the most visible ones ran directly through the person of Henry II himself. Henry II was credited with boundless energy and drive. He was of stocky build and had piercing gray eyes, red hair, and a ferocious temper to match. He was extraordinary and he knew it, and that combination of genuine greatness and absolute certainty of that greatness made him, at times, catastrophically impossible to be around. He picked fights with the church. He picked fights with his barons. He picked fights with his own family. And he picked one fight in particular that would define his reign in ways that no military victory ever quite managed to erase. Thomas Becket. Becket had been Henry's friend. Genuinely his friend, in the way that men who share enormous ambition and enormous capability can be friends when they are young and the world is still opening rather than closing. They hunted and played chess together. People said the 2 men had but one heart and one mind. When Henry became king, Becket became his chancellor. Both furious workers, they labored tirelessly to bring law and order to Henry's realm. And then Henry made the decision that would eventually destroy that friendship, and set in motion events that would haunt the rest of his reign. He appointed Becket Archbishop of Canterbury. The idea was elegant, his best friend, his most trusted ally, his loyal chancellor, now installed at the head of the English Church. Henry would have the church and the crown aligned, controlled, cooperative. It was, on paper, a perfect plan. It was not, in practice, anything of the kind. Once given this new role, Archbishop Thomas Becket took his new job very seriously indeed. He became a holy and dedicated priest who fought the king's attempts to rule the church. The man who had been Henry's hunting companion, his chess partner, his co-architect of English law, transformed, apparently genuinely, not performatively, into the most principled, stubborn, and inconvenient churchman in England. He refused to let Henry bring clergy before royal courts. He refused to subordinate the church's authority to the crown's. He refused to be what Henry had appointed him to be. When Henry, in Normandy, heard of Becket's latest action, he exploded with rage. He berated his household for being a pack of miserable curs and traitors who stood idly by while a low-born priest treated their king with contempt. And then, in that rage, came the most famous words Henry II ever uttered. Henry grew so exasperated by Thomas Becket that one day, in public, he asked of no one in particular, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" The question was meant to be rhetorical, but 4 of his knights took the question literally. They travelled to Canterbury and murdered Thomas Becket in the cathedral on December 29, 1170. In the cathedral. At vespers. For knights with swords, in a consecrated church, cutting down the Archbishop of Canterbury while he knelt in prayer. The shock that rolled across Europe was total. The outrage amongst members of the clergy and nobility caused Henry to back down. Although he had given no direct order to murder Thomas, the king had to perform a penance for his connection to the whole sorry affair. Thomas Becket was made a saint by the Pope in 1173. Henry punished himself by getting whipped by the monks of Canterbury, and acknowledged his wrongdoing, which, as well as seeming a genuine apology, worked wonders for him as a propaganda move. Henry II, the most powerful ruler in Western Europe, stripped to the waist in Canterbury Cathedral, being flogged by monks as penance for the murder of his former best friend. There is no image from the entire reign that captures Henry's genius and his catastrophic flaw more precisely than that one. He was smart enough to know he had to do it. He was political enough to turn it into a public relations recovery. And he was Henry enough to have created the crisis in the first place. Eleanor of Aquitaine moved back to France after Becket's murder. 1 quiet sentence. 8 words. Eleanor moved back to France. No drama, no public statement, no recorded reaction. Just a woman quietly extracting herself from the orbit of a crisis that was not of her making and a marriage that was becoming, with each passing year, more battle than partnership. She went home to Poitiers. She went home to her court, her children, her troubadours, her poets, her independence. She went back to the one place in Europe where Eleanor of Aquitaine was unambiguously in charge. And there, in Poitiers, she began the next chapter. A chapter that Henry would spend the rest of his life trying to undo. Because here is what nobody ever fully says about Eleanor as Queen of England and Mother of Kings. The children were not just her legacy. They were her long game. Every son educated, positioned, and groomed was a future power center that she controlled the relationship with. Every daughter married into a royal house extended her network across the continent. Having such an ambitious and talented family was seen as a strength initially, particularly after Eleanor gave birth to a host of sons, but it would eventually prove to be Henry's undoing. Henry built the empire. Eleanor built the family. And in the medieval world, where succession and loyalty were everything, Eleanor's investment was the one that compounded with interest over decades. By the late 1160s, the marriage was a cold truce at best. Henry's infidelities were an open secret and occasionally an open scandal. Eleanor returned to Aquitaine in about 1168 with 2 of their sons, Richard and Geoffrey. Her relationship with Henry was strained, partly due to his neglect of their children. Not just neglect of her. Neglect of the children she had spent the better part of a decade producing, educating, and shaping. Henry dangled titles and inheritance before his sons and then withdrew them. He promised Richard his father's territory and then reconsidered. He promised young Henry his own governance and then kept all real authority for himself. He was a man who needed to be the only powerful thing in every room, including rooms full of his own children. Eleanor watched this. Made her calculations. And in 1173, she acted on them. But that particular chapter, the Great Rebellion, the arrest, the 16 years, comes next. For now, let us simply hold this image. Eleanor of Aquitaine, in her 40s, in the court at Poitiers that she had filled with poetry and music and the electric conversation of the best minds available in 12th century France. Her sons around her. Her daughters placed across the map of Europe. An empire to her north that she had helped build charter by charter, court session by court session, regency by regency. A husband to the north of that who had once been an equal and had become something more complicated and less comfortable. And behind her, in the warm south, 67 years of Aquitaine, her land, her inheritance, the place she had never stopped belonging to since her father put her on a horse and took her with him to learn how the world was run. She had been Queen of France. She was Queen of England. She was, in her own right and without any qualification, Duchess of Aquitaine. And she was not, by any measure, finished. Let us talk about what it actually took to push Eleanor of Aquitaine over the edge. Because here is something the dramatic version of this story tends to skip past in its rush to get to the rebellion and the imprisonment and the escape attempt in men's clothing. Eleanor did not wake up one morning in 1173 and spontaneously decide to overthrow her husband. This was not an impulsive decision. Eleanor of Aquitaine did not make impulsive decisions. She made calculated ones, sometimes over years, sometimes over decades, and she made them with the patient precision of someone who had spent her entire life watching powerful people underestimate her and filing away what that felt like for future reference. The rebellion of 1173 was the result of years of accumulation. Of grievances layered on grievances like geological strata, each one pressing down on the ones beneath until the whole structure cracked. If you want to understand why Eleanor did what she did, you have to understand what Henry had been doing to the people she loved most. Starting with her children. In 1173, Henry had 4 legitimate sons: Henry, called the young king, Richard, later called the Lionheart, Geoffrey, and John, all of whom stood to inherit some or all of his possessions. 4 sons. Each one promised a future. Each one raised with the expectation that when his time came, he would step into real power and real governance over the lands his parents had built. Henry II had other ideas. Young Henry was treated particularly unfairly. Richard was given Aquitaine, Geoffrey was given Brittany, and John was given 3 important castles. But young Henry, the eldest, was given no territory of his own and no real power despite his title of king. Young Henry, the eldest son, already crowned King of England in 1170 in a ceremony designed to secure the succession, crowned in Westminster Abbey, anointed, blessed, recognized by the church and the nobility as the king in waiting, and yet possessing precisely 0 actual authority. He had the title. He had the crown. He had the ceremonies. What he did not have was any land, any income of his own, any court, any meaningful decisions to make, or any sense whatsoever that his father intended to share power with him before dying. The immediate practical cause of the rebellion was Henry II's decision to bequeath 3 castles, which were within the realm of the young king's inheritance, to his youngest son, John, as part of arrangements for John's marriage to the daughter of the Count of Maurienne. He gave John his eldest son's castles as a wedding gift for a marriage negotiation. If you wanted to design a single action guaranteed to detonate the barely contained resentment of an 18-year-old who had been crowned king and given nothing real to govern, giving away his inheritance to his little brother to sweeten a marriage deal would be a fairly efficient approach. Young Henry didn't erupt immediately. He stewed. And around him, hovering with careful attention, was his mother, who had been watching Henry II treat their children as pieces in a political game for years. Who had been watching her own authority in Aquitaine eroded by her husband's increasing overreach into her lands. Who had watched the murder of Thomas Becket destroy what remained of Henry's moral credibility with the church and the nobility. Who had, over 14 years of marriage, accumulated a list of grievances long enough to paper the walls of Winchester Castle. Eleanor had been Duchess of Aquitaine for quite some time by the time of the revolt and had become more and more displeased with Henry's increasing overreach onto her lands. It was the culmination of these grievances that led Eleanor, sensing an opportunity to get back at Henry through her son's rebellion, to finally rise up against her husband. Sensing an opportunity. That phrase is important. Eleanor did not create this rebellion from nothing. She saw the conditions that made it possible, recognized the moment, and applied the force of her personality, her military resources, and her relationship with her sons at exactly the right point of leverage. She did what she had always done. She watched the board. She waited for the right moment. And then she moved. In 1173, Eleanor's eldest son Henry rebelled against his father and fled to the French court for support. His father-in-law, King Louis VII, welcomed the disgruntled Angevin prince. Eleanor, having sided with her sons against her husband, sent two of her other sons, 15-year-old Richard and 14-year-old Geoffrey, to join their older brother at the French court, while she rallied her barons in Poitou to their cause. 15 and 14. She sent 15-year-old Richard and 14-year-old Geoffrey across the border to join a rebellion against their father. And then she stayed in Poitiers, in the city she had turned into the most culturally sophisticated court in 12th century Europe, and raised the barons of Poitou in open revolt. This was not a woman operating through subtle suggestion. This was Eleanor of Aquitaine in the open field, committing to a course of action with complete clarity and complete disregard for what happened to her if it failed. A letter from the Archbishop of Rouen shamed her for pushing her sons into rebellion against their father, indicating that she was the real power behind it. She united her sons against their father and used the discontent in the southern Angevin lands by offering her sons as an alternative. The Archbishop of Rouen wrote her a letter. An archbishop. Writing to a queen to tell her, in the formal language of ecclesiastical reproach, that she was the real engine of a rebellion against the King of England. That is not the letter you write to a peripheral figure. That is the letter you write to the person you believe is actually running things. The coalition against Henry was extraordinary. Louis VII, who had matured into a wily operator, supported Henry's disaffected sons against their father, as he had previously supported Becket against Henry. Eleanor's first husband, now supporting Eleanor's sons in a rebellion against her second husband. History, if it has a sense of humor, was certainly exercising it in 1173. King William of Scotland joined. Disaffected barons across England, Normandy, Brittany, and Aquitaine joined. Barons like Robert, Earl of Leicester, Hugh Earl of Chester, and William de Ferrers all wanted to deteriorate Henry II's authority and regain their confiscated lands. Henry II, the man who had spent 2 decades making enemies by being the most effective ruler in Western Europe, was now confronting the accumulated resentment of virtually every power bloc he had ever constrained. His wife. His sons. His former wife's former husband. His barons. His neighbors. He was, by any reasonable military assessment of the coalition ranged against him, finished. He was not finished. The rebellion lasted 18 months and cost many lives before it was finally crushed. Henry's vigorous military action and talented local commanders defeated the coalition. Henry II, the man who rolled on floors and chewed straw when he was angry, turned out to be considerably harder to defeat militarily than his enemies had accounted for. He moved fast. He moved decisively. He crossed the Channel at speed, crushed the English rebels before they could consolidate, captured the King of Scotland, and methodically dismantled the coalition that had looked, from the outside, like it should have overwhelmed him. Richard went to Henry II court at Poitiers on September 23 and begged for forgiveness, weeping and falling at the feet of Henry, who gave Richard the kiss of peace. Several days later, Richard's brothers joined him in seeking reconciliation with their father. Richard, 15 years old, weeping, on his knees. Eleanor's favorite son, the one she had backed most fiercely, the one she had sent across the border with the most conviction, now prostrate before his father asking for forgiveness. The terms he received were less generous than those offered earlier in the conflict. Richard was given control of 2 castles in Poitou and half the income of Aquitaine. Henry forgave his sons. He was, for all his flaws, not interested in destroying his own dynastic legacy by permanently alienating the heirs he needed. He reconciled with young Henry. He reconciled with Richard. He reconciled with Geoffrey. He gave them terms, reduced terms, humiliating terms, but terms nonetheless. The exception was his wife Eleanor, who remained his prisoner for 16 years until his death in 1189. Sons could rebel against their father. That was boys being boys, muscular and ambitious and easily led by bad advisors. It was not, in the medieval view of the world, unforgivable. Sons were the future. Sons could be reconciled, redirected, given slightly less humiliating terms and sent back into the structure of dynastic inheritance. For a wife to rebel against her husband was practically unheard of, and therefore deserved harsher punishment. Unforgiven and defeated, Eleanor was sent to perpetual imprisonment in various castles. That sentence contains the entire medieval worldview about women and power compressed into 2 clauses. Practically unheard of. Harsher punishment. Eleanor hadn't done anything her sons hadn't done. She had supported a rebellion. She had raised troops. She had used her political connections to build a coalition. The sons had done those things too, and the sons got reduced castles and a stern talking to. Eleanor got 16 years. The difference was not the action. The difference was the gender. A woman who rebelled against her husband wasn't just a political problem. She was a moral catastrophe. A violation of the natural order so fundamental that it couldn't be reconciled with a kiss of peace and a slightly smaller inheritance. It had to be contained. Permanently. On July 8, 1174, Henry took ship for England from Barfla. He brought Eleanor on the ship. As soon as they disembarked at Southampton, Eleanor was taken either to Winchester Castle or Sarum Castle and held there. Old Sarum. You can still visit it. A windswept Iron Age hill fort in Wiltshire, the remains of a medieval castle perched on top of chalk downland with views that stretch in every direction and wind that comes straight off the English plain without apology. It is a striking place now. In the 1170s and 1180s, it was Eleanor of Aquitaine's entire world. Henry kept her under tight control, moving her between castles across England. She spent time at Winchester, Old Sarum, Ludgershall, and various royal manors in Buckinghamshire and Nottinghamshire. These weren't dungeons, but they weren't palaces either. Cold stone walls. Limited space. A reduced household. She had ladies-in-waiting and some comforts, but no political voice and no freedom to travel or rule. Henry ensured that Eleanor led a queenly lifestyle, with hunting, feasting, and fine clothes, but she no longer played a queen's role in the governance of the realm. This detail is worth sitting with. Henry made sure she had fine clothes. He made sure the Sheriff of Wiltshire spent considerable money on her maintenance. Fine clothes for Eleanor and her household were dispatched regularly from London, and between 1175 and 1180 the Sheriff of Wiltshire spent large amounts on the Queen's maintenance at the castle. She dressed like a queen. She ate like a queen. She was housed, if modestly by her own previous standards, with the dignity appropriate to her station. And she had no power whatsoever. None. Zero. She issued only one extant charter in her 15 years of imprisonment. 1. The woman who had issued charters continuously for 2 decades, who had presided over courts and administered territories and governed England in her husband's absence, now produced a single legal document in 16 years. Not because she had lost the ability. Because she had lost the freedom. That is a specific and deliberate cruelty. Not the cruelty of dungeons and starvation. The cruelty of a gilded cage with hunting and feasting and fine clothes and absolutely no meaningful activity for a mind that had been running empires since the age of 15. Eleanor of Aquitaine, dressed beautifully, doing nothing that mattered. If Henry wanted to hurt her, he found precisely the right way. And then the losses began. Henry the young king died of dysentery on June 11, 1183. Geoffrey then died in an accident at a medieval tournament on August 19, 1186. 2 sons. Dead. While their mother sat in Wiltshire under guard. Eleanor was still at Old Sarum in 1183 when her son the young king became ill and on his deathbed begged for his mother's freedom. When he died, Eleanor was sent the news but reportedly said that she had already foretold his death in a dream. Her eldest living son used his dying breath to ask his father to release his mother. Henry II refused. The son died. Eleanor was told the news by messenger. In a castle in Wiltshire. With guards at the door. There is no record of what Eleanor said or did in the hours after receiving that news. No chronicler was in the room. No letter survives. What we know is that she received it, and that she did not break. Because the evidence of what came next, of the sharpness and speed and competence with which she operated the moment she was freed, tells you that whatever happened in that room, whatever grief or fury or despair moved through Eleanor of Aquitaine in the moment she learned her son was gone, she did not allow it to unmake her. She grieved and she endured and she kept the part of herself that mattered intact for when it would be needed again. Subsequently, Eleanor seemed to be granted greater freedom. She was allowed to leave Old Sarum under guard when King Henry summoned her to France for 6 months. In this later period of her imprisonment she was occasionally allowed to join Henry for ceremonial duties as queen, though still under heavy supervision. The bars on the cage loosened slightly. Not because Henry had forgiven her. Not because he had changed his mind. Because she was still, technically, his queen, and there were moments when the empire needed its queen to be visible for diplomatic purposes. So Eleanor appeared at Christmas courts. She was escorted to France. She was presented to the world as a queen, briefly, and then escorted back to her captivity. It is, if you think about it for a moment, a remarkably strange arrangement. The most powerful woman in Europe, under permanent house arrest, being temporarily released to perform the ceremonial functions of a role she was otherwise not permitted to exercise. Henry needed Eleanor's face and Eleanor's title. He just didn't want Eleanor's judgment or Eleanor's authority or Eleanor's capacity to turn any room she entered into a seat of power. He got the first two without the third. For 16 years, he managed it. And then he started losing his war with Richard. By 1189, Philip II of France had swayed Richard to his side, leading to a final rebellion. Henry II, suffering from a bleeding ulcer which sapped the extraordinary energy that had been a hallmark of his earlier reign, was decisively defeated by Philip and Richard. Richard. The son Eleanor had loved best. The one she had sent across the border at 15. The one who had wept at his father's feet and been granted lesser terms. Richard had waited. Had watched. Had rebuilt his position. And when the moment was right, when his father was aging, ill, militarily overextended, and his ally Philip of France had decided that now was the moment, Richard moved. It was said that as John was Henry's favorite son, his betrayal broke the king's heart. Henry II finally died in 1189, his army defeated by the forces of Richard and his ally, King Philip II of France. John. The favorite. The one Henry had favored above all the others, the youngest, the one he had tried to protect and provide for. John joined Richard and Philip against his own father. And that defection, according to the chroniclers who were there, was what finally broke Henry II. Not the military defeat. Not the bleeding ulcer. The knowledge that his favorite child had turned against him at the end. Henry II died on July 6, 1189, at Chinon Castle in France. Defeated. Betrayed. Surrounded by enemies that included two of his own sons. He was 56 years old. Richard and Eleanor lay beside him at his death. He had never believed his sons could do as well as him. Richard and John proved him right. That image. Eleanor at the deathbed of the man who had imprisoned her for 16 years. We don't know what she felt standing there. We don't know if there was anything left of the complicated, ferocious, sometimes genuine connection that had once made them the most formidable couple in Europe. We don't know if she grieved, or felt relief, or experienced the particular hollow exhaustion of someone who has been waiting for something for so long that when it finally arrives it doesn't feel like anything at all. What we do know is what she did next. Even before Richard's coronation as King of England, Eleanor traveled all over the kingdom to forge alliances and foster goodwill. She didn't rest. She didn't recover. She didn't write reflective letters from a comfortable retirement. She walked out of 16 years of captivity at the age of 67 and immediately started working. She crisscrossed England. She built alliances. She prepared the ground for her son's coronation with the efficiency of someone who had been planning this moment in her head for 16 years because there was nothing else to do in a castle in Wiltshire. She had been waiting. She had been watching. She had been, in the only way available to her, preparing. And now she was free. And the world, which had spent 16 years without Eleanor of Aquitaine in it at full capacity, was about to be reminded of exactly what that felt like. Here is the thing nobody tells you about Eleanor of Aquitaine being freed from 16 years of imprisonment. She was 67 years old. In the 12th century, 67 was not what 67 is today. There was no modern medicine, no reliable nutrition science, no understanding of infection beyond the vague notion that God was probably involved. Life expectancy for a woman who had survived childbirth 10 times, traveled across 2 continents, gone on crusade, been imprisoned for a decade and a half in English castles, and endured the kind of sustained political stress that would age a modern politician into dust, life expectancy for that woman, by the arithmetic of the age, should have been somewhere in the rear-view mirror. The people who watched Eleanor walk out of captivity in 1189 almost certainly assumed she was winding down. That they were witnessing a graceful exit from the stage. That the next stop, after a period of dignified and well-deserved rest, was a convent and then a grave and then a place in the chronicle as a footnote to the reign of Henry II. They were wrong with a thoroughness that deserves its own celebration. Far from enjoying her elderly years in reclusive peace, Eleanor would make up for lost time, exercising unprecedented power and building her reputation as the most remarkable woman in medieval history. Making up for lost time. 16 years of lost time, to be precise. 16 years of fine clothes and reduced authority and one extant charter and watching her children's lives unfold from behind guarded windows. 16 years of a mind that had run empires being given nothing to run. Eleanor of Aquitaine did not ease back into public life. She detonated back into it. Her first task was to prepare the country to welcome the stranger who was their new king. Eleanor focused on undoing some of Henry's most unpopular actions, all in Richard's name, and ruthlessly playing on her emotional capital. Think about that sentence for a moment. She undid Henry's most unpopular actions. In Richard's name. Before Richard had even been crowned. Eleanor of Aquitaine, 72 hours out of 16 years of captivity, was already governing. Already making political decisions. Already deploying her accumulated emotional capital, the sympathy the English people felt for the Queen who had been unjustly imprisoned by her own husband, as a weapon on behalf of her son's incoming reign. When she released a group of prisoners, a statement was made that she personally understood the troubles of those imprisoned, a touch worthy of a modern PR advisor. A glorious coronation was planned, music composed at Eleanor's command to proclaim Richard as the king who would welcome an era of peace and prosperity. Her popularity was well evidenced by the fact that the planned exclusion of women from the coronation was relaxed in her favor at the request of the nobles of England. She released prisoners and made sure everyone knew why. She commissioned music. She arranged a coronation. She managed the political narrative of a new reign before that reign had technically begun. And the English nobility, who had watched her imprisoned for 16 years and had not forgotten it, asked specifically that she be included in a ceremony women were ordinarily barred from. Because Eleanor of Aquitaine, even after everything, commanded that kind of feeling from the people who had seen her operate at full capacity. On September 3, 1189, Richard was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey in the presence of his adoring mother. At this point she was 67, a very old woman for her times, but one who kept well. She stood in Westminster Abbey and watched her favorite son crowned King of England. The son she had raised, educated, armed with her cultural inheritance, sent across a border at 15, argued with a husband over, been imprisoned partly to protect. He was king. And she was free. And in that moment, whatever calculation or grief or relief moved through Eleanor of Aquitaine as Richard received his crown, we know at minimum this: she was not finished. Richard, almost immediately, proved himself to be Eleanor's son in every dimension except the one that would have been politically convenient. He was brave, brilliant, militarily extraordinary, culturally sophisticated, and possessed of approximately zero interest in governing England now that he had it. What Richard wanted to do was crusade. What Richard wanted was the Holy Land, not the English countryside. He was a soldier king, not an administrator king. He wanted glory, not accounts. The following year Richard left for the Middle East on his joint crusade with King Philip II, stopping in Sicily and then Cyprus. In Sicily he reunited with his mother, who had traveled first to France, then to Navarre where she made a deal with its king, Sancho the Wise, to have his daughter Berengaria marry Richard. Eleanor traveled to Navarre. Personally. At the age of 68. Over the Pyrenees. In winter. To negotiate her son's marriage to the daughter of the King of Navarre, because apparently finding her son a wife was something she needed to go and do herself rather than delegating to anyone whose judgment she trusted less than her own. From there, Eleanor and her future daughter-in-law traveled over the Alps, reaching Richard just before his departure. Over the Alps. At 68. With a girl she had just collected from Navarre in tow. Eleanor ruled England as regent in Richard's name while he was away. She was often referred to in contemporary documents as holding regal authority. Not acting regent. Not regent in name only. Regal authority. Real power. The kind of authority that issued writs and made decisions and kept John, who was already circling the throne with the expression of a man calculating his chances, firmly in his place. It has been suggested that when Eleanor's youngest son John plotted to take over from Richard and aligned himself with King Philip II of France, she acted to secure England and persuaded John not to continue with his plot. She talked John out of a coup. Her youngest son, who was actively planning to steal his brother's throne, was persuaded by his mother to stand down. Whether through threat, emotional appeal, political argument, or the particular tone of voice that only a mother who has survived 2 marriages to kings and 16 years in prison can produce, we don't know. But John stood down. That is Eleanor governing at 70. Not with armies. With a conversation. And then came the ransom. Richard had been on crusade. He had fought brilliantly at Acre, at Arsuf, at Jaffa. He had come closer to recapturing Jerusalem than any crusader since the fall of the city. He had made a truce with Saladin that secured Christian access to the holy sites. And then, on his way home across Europe, he had been captured. When Richard's ship was wrecked near Aquileia and Richard had to travel overland to get back home, he passed through Vienna, enabling Duke Leopold of Austria to capture him around Christmas 1192. Interfering with a crusader was against papal decree, but Richard had also personally offended Leopold. He had insulted Leopold at the siege of Acre. Thrown down his banner. Made an enemy of the man whose territory he later had to pass through on his way home from the wars. Richard the Lionheart, the greatest military mind of his generation, had been undone not by an army but by a diplomatic slight and a shipwreck. Henry demanded a ransom of 150,000 marks, 100,000 pounds of silver. Richard's mother Eleanor, now in her early 70s, took action, riding the country to raise funds and writing the Pope about the horrible situation. 100,000 pounds of silver. 3 times the annual income of the English crown. That was the price they set on Eleanor's son's freedom. And Eleanor looked at that number, a number that would have made a modern treasury wince, and went to work. Eleanor worked hard to raise the ransom for the captive king, taxing both clergy and laymen and confiscating gold and silver treasures from churches. She taxed. She confiscated. She requisitioned church gold and silver, which was the kind of thing that got people excommunicated in less urgent circumstances. She raised money from every possible source with the relentless efficiency of someone who had been managing empires and issuing charters since her teens and had absolutely no time for the suggestion that this couldn't be done. And she wrote to the Pope. She wrote letters to Pope Celestine III that belong in the literature of grief and fury and political pressure simultaneously. She signed one of them, Eleanor, by the wrath of God, Queen of England. By the wrath of God. Not by the grace of God, the conventional formula. By the wrath. Eleanor of Aquitaine, in her 70s, was signing her diplomatic correspondence with a phrase that essentially said, "God is angry on my behalf and you should probably take that seriously." To her revered father and Lord Celestine, by the grace of God the highest pontiff, in the wrath of God Queen of the English, to show himself a father to her, a suffering mother. Grief is not very different from illness. In the impetus of its fire it does not recognize lords, it does not fear colleagues, it does not respect or spare anyone, not even itself. Let no one be surprised, then, if the power of grief makes the words more harsh. Let no one be surprised if the power of grief makes the words more harsh. She is warning the Pope. Warning the most powerful religious figure on earth that her letters are going to be blunt because her grief licenses it, and if he finds them harsh then he should consider what it feels like to have raised a son from birth, loved him above all others, watched him crowned king, and then received word that he is in chains in a German castle. She is not asking the Pope for help. She is telling him that he has failed her and that she expects better. Eleanor famously wrote to Pope Celestine III demanding intervention, "I am wasted with torment. My bones cling to my skin. My bones cling to my skin." A woman in her early 70s writing to the Pope in polished Latin, deploying the language of physical suffering with the precision of someone who knows exactly what image will land hardest in a papal reader's imagination. She is not simply venting grief. She is deploying grief strategically, as she had deployed everything in her life. The emotion is real. The deployment of it is calculated. Both things can be true simultaneously, and in Eleanor of Aquitaine both things almost always were. In February 1194, Richard the Lionheart was freed from captivity. The ransom was paid. Eleanor collected his ransom and went in person to escort him to England. She went in person to escort him home. Eleanor of Aquitaine, 72 years old, crossed the English Channel and the German territories and collected her captive son from the Holy Roman Emperor and brought him back to England. Because apparently sending a delegation was not something she was willing to do when she could go herself. Richard ruled for 10 more years. He spent almost none of them in England. He was always somewhere else, fighting, campaigning, managing his continental holdings, doing the things that Richard the Lionheart was built for. Eleanor governed. Issued charters. Managed John. Kept the structure intact. And then, in 1199, at the siege of Calais in Aquitaine, Eleanor's own land, the land she had inherited at 15 and loved for 80 years, Richard was struck by a crossbow bolt from the castle walls. A wound that should have been minor. An infection that moved through him with the speed and arbitrariness that medieval medicine could neither predict nor stop. When Richard was mortally wounded at the siege of Calais, Eleanor rushed to be with him at the end. On April 6, 1199, he ended his earthly day in her arms. In her arms. Her 77-year-old arms, around the son she had loved most of all her children. In her own duchy. On the ground she had inherited as a girl and governed for a lifetime. Richard died as Eleanor of Aquitaine held him. And then she arranged for his body to be carried to Fontevraud for burial, as she had arranged everything else in her life. With competence and without visible collapse. She had outlived another son. She had now outlived 4 of her 5 sons by Henry. Young Henry, gone of dysentery in 1183. Geoffrey, gone in a tournament accident in 1186. Richard, gone now from a crossbow bolt and a medieval infection in 1199. She had buried them all. She kept standing. John. The favorite. The one Henry had loved most. The youngest. The one Eleanor had always understood least but served most consistently in his later need. John was now King of England. And the political situation he had inherited was, to put it diplomatically, a mess. Eleanor, nearly 80 years old, fearing the disintegration of the Plantagenet domain, crossed the Pyrenees in 1200 to fetch her granddaughter Blanche from the court of Castile and marry her to the son of the French king. By this marriage she hoped to ensure peace between the Plantagenets of England and the Capetian kings of France. Nearly 80. The Pyrenees Mountains. In winter. On horseback. Let us be entirely clear about what this means in physical terms. The Pyrenees mountain range forms the border between France and Spain. It is not a gentle range of rolling hills. It is a serious mountain chain, crossing which in the year 1200, in January, without modern equipment, modern roads, or modern weatherproofing, required a level of physical resilience that most people 60 years younger than Eleanor would have found challenging. She crossed it because John needed a marriage alliance with France and she was the one who would go and make it happen. Just outside Poitiers she was ambushed and held captive by Hugh IX of Lusignan. Eleanor secured her release by agreeing to his demands and continued on her journey south. She was ambushed. On the way. By a local lord who thought capturing the 77-year-old Queen Mother of England was a reasonable political gambit. Eleanor negotiated her own release, made the concessions necessary to continue, and then continued. No turning back. No sending for help. She dealt with the situation, filed the information away about Hugh of Lusignan for future reference, and kept riding south. After meeting the two sisters, their grandmother Eleanor judged that Blanche's personality was more fit to fulfill the role of Queen of France. The original plan had been for Blanche's sister Urraca to make the marriage. Eleanor met both girls, assessed them both, and changed the plan. Because Eleanor of Aquitaine trusted her own judgment on what a future Queen of France needed to be made of, having spent her entire life knowing exactly what a Queen of France needed to be made of from the inside. Eleanor remained at the Castilian court for 2 months, spending time with the daughter she had not seen in decades. Late in March, Eleanor set off back across the Pyrenees with her granddaughter Blanche. She celebrated Easter at Bordeaux. 2 months with her daughter Eleanor of Castile, whom she had last seen as a child being sent south to her marriage. 2 months of reunion, of watching a daughter she had shaped from birth navigate a life Eleanor had arranged for her, in a kingdom Eleanor had chosen, with a king Eleanor had selected. And then the ride back. Back over the mountains. Back through France. Back through the remainder of a life that refused to end until it was finished. Blanche of Castile would marry the future Louis VIII of France and eventually become one of the most powerful regents in French history. The girl Eleanor chose. Traveled to collect. Assessed against her sister and selected on the basis of personality. That girl became one of the most powerful female rulers in French history. Eleanor had, quite literally, selected the next generation of greatness. She had looked at 2 young women and identified the one who had what the role required. It was the last great act of political judgment in a life defined by political judgment. And she got it right. In the same year she helped to defend Anjou and Aquitaine against her grandson Arthur of Brittany, thus securing John's French possessions. Arthur of Brittany was the son of Geoffrey, Eleanor's 3rd son by Henry, the one who had died in a tournament accident in 1186. Arthur had a claim to the English throne and was, with French backing, pressing that claim militarily. The 78-year-old queen successfully withstood a siege at Mirbeau until John appeared and finally took Arthur prisoner in 1202. 78 years old. Under military siege. Holding a castle. While John came to relieve her. That is the last recorded act of Eleanor of Aquitaine in direct political power. Not a ceremony. Not a letter. Not a diplomatic arrangement. A military siege. At 78. Held until her son arrived. After that, finally, she allowed herself to stop. Eleanor retired to the Abbey of Fontevraud in 1200, exhausted by the continental politics she had dominated for so long. Exhausted. Not defeated. Not finished on anyone else's schedule. Exhausted, on her own terms, after 80 years of motion, after exhausting everything the world had offered her and offering quite a lot back in return. She retired to Fontevraud, the abbey she had been a patron of for decades, the place where Henry lay buried and where Richard now lay beside him. In the 1190s she moved to a house in the village, where, surrounded by a small court of ladies in waiting and relatives, she lived an intensely religious life. A dozen or so clerics attended to her spiritual needs, and the chapel of Saint Laurent was set aside for her exclusive use. During this time she prayed and did penance for the souls of her parents. For her parents. The father who had taken her everywhere with him and shown her how the world worked. The mother who died when she was 8 and whom she had never quite stopped missing, in the way that people who lose a mother young never quite stop missing them, regardless of how much power and experience accumulates between that loss and the end of their lives. Eleanor commissioned lifelike effigies to be carved for herself and for Henry and for Richard, choosing to have a book in her hands in her own effigy, to reflect her lifelong interest in and support of the arts. A book. She chose a book for her hands. Not a scepter. Not a crown. Not a sword. A book, in the hands of a woman who had been born in the most cultivated court in France, who had filled 2 different kingdoms with poets and troubadours, who had patronized the tradition of courtly love, who had carried Latin and philosophy and literature through a life that gave her almost no time to sit still and read. The book in the hands of Eleanor's effigy is the detail that tells you who she was underneath all the politics. Not the queen. Not the rebel. The reader. The thinker. The woman from Aquitaine who grew up believing that culture and power were the same thing. She is right there, in stone, in Fontevraud Abbey, reclined on her tomb with a crown on her head and a book open in her hands. You can still visit her. She looks entirely at peace. She looks, honestly, like someone who has read the last page of something very long and very satisfying and is taking a moment before starting the next one. Eleanor of Aquitaine died at Fontevraud on April 1, 1204, and was buried there alongside Henry, Richard, and her youngest daughter Joan. 82 years old. Duchess of Aquitaine for 67 years without interruption. Queen of France. Queen of England. Crusader. Rebel. Prisoner. Regent. Ransom raiser. Mountain crosser. Grandmother of nations. Her contribution to England extended beyond her own lifetime. After the loss of Normandy in 1204, it was her own ancestral lands, not the old Norman territories, that remained loyal to England. She has been misjudged by many historians who noted only her youthful frivolity, ignoring the tenacity, political wisdom, and energy that characterized the years of her maturity. Ignoring the tenacity, political wisdom, and energy of the years of her maturity. As though the 60 years after the Antioch scandal didn't count. As though what happened in 10 days in 1148 was more defining than what happened across the 8 decades that surrounded it. As though a woman could be reduced to her worst scandal and her most exciting rumor and her most convenient narrative, rather than seen in full, the complicated, driven, brilliant, occasionally ruthless, consistently extraordinary person who lived inside all of those stories simultaneously. She outlived nearly everyone who tried to define her. Louis VII. Henry II. Thomas Becket. Raymond of Antioch. Rosamund Clifford. Young Henry. Geoffrey. Richard. She outlived them all and she kept working until there was nothing left to do. Her legacy is immeasurable. Politically, she shaped the destinies of both France and England for generations. Dynastically, her descendants sat on thrones across Europe. And there in the church at Fontevraud, if you go, and you should, it is extraordinary, you can stand between the effigies of Henry and Richard and Eleanor, the 3 of them laid out in stone in the same room, the family that shaped the 12th century more than any other. The king who built the empire. The king who made it famous. And the woman who made both of them possible, who outlasted them both, who governed when they were gone and grieved when she had to and kept moving long after the world had decided she should stop. Eleanor of Aquitaine. Queen of two kingdoms. Mother of kings. Grandmother of Europe. And in the end, as at the beginning, the woman from Aquitaine. With a book in her hands. Now, you find yourself traveling back through the mists of the 12th century, leaving behind the noise and distractions of the modern world and entering a landscape of forests, vineyards, winding rivers, and stone villages scattered across the Holy Roman Empire. Long before towering cathedrals dominated the skyline and centuries before the Renaissance transformed Europe, there lived a woman whose life would astonish kings, bishops, emperors, and ordinary people alike. Her name was Hildegard of Bingen, and although she was born into a world that offered women few opportunities for influence, she would become one of the most remarkable minds of the Middle Ages. The story begins around the year 1098, when Europe itself was changing. The First Crusade was reshaping the relationship between East and West. Castles were rising across the countryside. Monasteries flourished as centers of prayer, learning, and culture. In the German lands that formed part of the Holy Roman Empire, noble families struggled for power while bishops and emperors argued over authority. Amid these tensions, life for ordinary people remained difficult and uncertain. Most families depended upon the harvest. Disease and famine were never far away. Superstition blended naturally with faith, and the rhythms of everyday existence followed the seasons and the church calendar. It was into this world that Hildegard entered as the 10th child of Hildebert and Mechthild, members of a noble but not exceptionally wealthy family. In medieval tradition, the 10th child was often considered a fitting offering to God, much as a tenth of the harvest was given as a tithe. From a young age, Hildegard's destiny would be connected to the church. Even during childhood, unusual experiences distinguished her from others. Hildegard later recalled that she perceived strange visions while still very young. Brilliant lights and vivid scenes appeared before her eyes, accompanied by an overwhelming sense of divine presence. These experiences frightened her, and for many years she spoke about them only to a few trusted individuals. In an age deeply concerned with spiritual matters, such visions could inspire awe, suspicion, or both. By the age of 8, Hildegard was entrusted to the care of Jutta of Sponheim, a noblewoman who had chosen a religious life. Jutta lived near the monastery of Disibodenberg, nestled among rolling hills where forests met cultivated fields. The setting was peaceful and remote, offering an environment devoted to prayer and contemplation. There, young Hildegard began a life that would shape her future. Jutta herself embraced severe forms of religious devotion. Like many medieval mystics, she believed physical hardships brought one closer to God. Her days revolved around prayer, fasting, and spiritual discipline. Hildegard learned not only the prayers and customs of monastic life but also the importance of patience and perseverance. Despite the strict atmosphere, she possessed a curious mind that hungered for knowledge. Unlike most girls of her era, Hildegard received an education. She learned Latin hymns, studied scripture, and became familiar with the liturgical traditions of the Church. Though her formal education remained limited compared with male scholars, she absorbed information with remarkable enthusiasm. Nature fascinated her. Plants, animals, gemstones, and the changing seasons all seemed to reveal hidden truths about God's creation. As the years passed, additional women joined Jutta's small religious community. What had begun as a secluded existence gradually developed into something resembling a convent. Hildegard grew from a shy child into a respected young woman. Those around her noticed her intelligence, her piety, and her unusual spiritual experiences. Yet she remained hesitant to discuss the visions that had accompanied her throughout life. Meanwhile, Europe continued to evolve. Pilgrims traveled great distances seeking holy sites. Merchants carried goods between towns and kingdoms. Monasteries copied manuscripts by candlelight, preserving ancient knowledge for future generations. In these communities, books represented treasures more valuable than gold. Monks and nuns spent countless hours creating beautifully decorated pages that combined artistry with devotion. At Disibodenberg, Hildegard participated in this rich intellectual environment. She sang sacred music, memorized prayers, and observed the changing patterns of the natural world around her. Every sunrise over the hills, every storm that swept across the Rhine Valley, every bird that nested in the trees seemed to reinforce her conviction that creation itself reflected divine wisdom. When Hildegard reached adulthood, she formally became a nun. Her commitment to religious life deepened, but so did the visions that had accompanied her since childhood. She often experienced dazzling lights unlike anything she could adequately describe. Unlike dreams, these experiences occurred while she remained fully awake. They filled her mind with symbolic images and profound messages that she struggled to understand. For years, she kept these experiences largely secret. Humility was highly valued in medieval monastic culture, and Hildegard feared accusations of pride or deception. Women possessed limited authority within the church hierarchy, and claiming divine revelations could easily provoke criticism. Remaining silent seemed safer. Everything changed after the death of Jutta in 1136. The women of the community elected Hildegard as their leader. The responsibility was enormous. She now guided not only spiritual practices but also daily life within the convent. Her wisdom and compassion earned widespread respect. Yet the burden of leadership coincided with increasing pressure from the visions she could no longer ignore. According to Hildegard, a divine command urged her to write down everything she saw and heard. At first she resisted. Fear overwhelmed her. She doubted her abilities and worried that others would ridicule her claims. Medieval society offered few examples of women publicly sharing theological insights. Nevertheless, the visions persisted with growing intensity. Illness followed her refusal. Hildegard later believed her physical suffering resulted from resisting God's command. Eventually she confided in a monk named Volmar, who became one of her greatest supporters. Recognizing the sincerity of her experiences, Volmar encouraged her to record the revelations. His guidance proved crucial. Together they began an extraordinary project. Hildegard dictated descriptions of her visions while scribes carefully preserved her words. The work eventually became known as Civias, meaning, know the ways. Filled with vivid imagery and spiritual teachings, the manuscript explored creation, redemption, virtue, and humanity's relationship with God. The visions themselves were unlike anything most people had encountered. Hildegard described brilliant cosmic structures, wheels of fire, rivers of light, and symbolic figures representing virtues and vices. Her imagination seemed limitless, yet she insisted these images originated not from herself but from divine inspiration. News of the remarkable abbess gradually spread beyond the monastery. Clergymen, nobles, and scholars became curious. Some approached with skepticism, while others sensed something extraordinary. Reports reached influential figures within the church, including Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most respected spiritual leaders of the age. Bernard's support would prove decisive. Already famous throughout Europe, he possessed tremendous influence. After learning about Hildegard's visions, he encouraged their examination rather than dismissing them outright. His endorsement opened doors previously closed to women. Suddenly, the writings of a German abbess attracted attention far beyond her convent. Soon the matter reached Pope Eugenius III. During a church synod held at Trier, portions of Hildegard's writings were presented before assembled bishops and church leaders. The Pope listened carefully. Rather than condemning the visions, he approved them and encouraged Hildegard to continue writing. The decision transformed her life forever. For a woman living in the 12th century, papal recognition represented an astonishing achievement. It granted legitimacy to her work and established her reputation across Christendom. People who had never met her began seeking advice. Letters arrived from distant regions. Bishops consulted her. Nobles requested prayers. Ordinary believers looked to her for guidance. Yet fame brought new challenges. Hildegard remained deeply conscious of her humble origins. She considered herself merely an instrument through which divine wisdom flowed. Nevertheless, she understood that the opportunities placed before her carried enormous responsibility. As she gazed across the hills surrounding Disibodenberg, she could hardly have imagined how far her influence would eventually extend. Kings and emperors would seek her counsel. Popes would value her insights. Her music would survive centuries. Her writings on medicine and nature would fascinate scholars long after her death. Future generations would remember her as a visionary, composer, scientist, healer, theologian, and one of the most extraordinary women the Middle Ages ever produced. But those achievements still lay ahead. For now, the Abbess of Disibodenberg stood at the threshold of a remarkable journey, unaware that her voice would echo across 9 centuries and that history itself would one day recognize Hildegard of Bingen as a woman unlike any other. The years following the approval of her visions marked the beginning of an entirely new chapter in Hildegard's life. No longer known only within the walls of Disibodenberg, she found herself becoming one of the most respected voices in 12th-century Europe. Her reputation spread slowly at first, carried by travelers, monks, and bishops who spoke of the remarkable abbess whose visions had received papal recognition. In an age when news traveled at the speed of horses and riverboats, fame unfolded gradually, but once it began, it reached farther than anyone could have imagined. Despite the growing admiration surrounding her, life inside the monastery remained governed by routines that had changed little over generations. The ringing of bells marked the hours of prayer. Before sunrise, candles flickered in the darkness as voices rose together in song. The changing seasons determined the rhythm of work. Gardens required constant care. Manuscripts demanded patience and precision. Meals remained simple, and silence often accompanied daily tasks. Hildegard cherished these rhythms, yet she increasingly sensed that her community required greater independence. The women under her leadership had expanded in number, and the limitations imposed by the monks of Disibodenberg became more apparent with each passing year. Resources, authority, and decisions remained largely controlled by male clergy. Hildegard believed her nuns deserved their own foundation where they could flourish under a separate administration. The idea was bold. Creating an independent convent required money, land, approval from powerful authorities, and enormous determination. Opposition appeared immediately. Abbot Kuno, who governed Disibodenberg, resisted the proposal. Losing Hildegard's community would mean losing prestige and valuable income. Many considered the project unrealistic, especially for a woman. Yet Hildegard was not easily discouraged. According to her own accounts, divine inspiration strengthened her resolve. She insisted that the new convent must be established on the Rupertsberg, near the town of Bingen. The location overlooked the Rhine River, one of Europe's great arteries of trade and communication. Vineyards covered the surrounding hills, while travelers and merchants moved constantly along the busy waterways below. Resistance from the monks intensified. Arguments continued. Appeals were made. Negotiations stretched on. Eventually, Hildegard became seriously ill. Those around her interpreted her condition differently. Some believed it stemmed from exhaustion, while Hildegard herself regarded it as a sign of spiritual distress caused by the delays. Her determination never wavered. At last, permission was granted. Around 1150, Hildegard and approximately 20 nuns left Disibodenberg and journeyed toward the Rupertsberg. The move represented much more than a change of location. It symbolized independence, vision, and the triumph of perseverance. Stone by stone, the new convent rose above the Rhine Valley. From this new home, Hildegard's influence expanded even further. Visitors arrived from distant lands seeking wisdom. Letters poured in with astonishing frequency. Nobles requested prayers for their families. Abbots sought advice concerning spiritual matters. Bishops asked for guidance. Even emperors corresponded with the abbess of Bingen. One of the most remarkable features of Hildegard's life was her willingness to speak boldly regardless of rank. Medieval society operated through rigid hierarchies. Most people accepted their place without question. Yet Hildegard addressed kings and popes with surprising frankness. She believed that truth mattered more than status. Among her correspondents was Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. Powerful and ambitious, Barbarossa struggled constantly with the papacy over questions of authority. Hildegard did not hesitate to criticize policies she considered harmful to the unity of the Church. Such courage was extraordinary. Few individuals, male or female, dared to speak so openly to one of Europe's mightiest rulers. Her letters reveal a woman deeply concerned about morality, justice, and spiritual renewal. She warned against corruption and pride. She encouraged humility and compassion. Although her language reflected the religious worldview of the Middle Ages, her passion and sincerity impressed contemporaries across social boundaries. Meanwhile, Hildegard's intellectual interests continued to broaden. Nature fascinated her endlessly. The forests surrounding the Rhine Valley became living libraries. Plants, animals, stones, and rivers all seemed to possess hidden meanings waiting to be understood. Rather than viewing science and faith as opposing forces, Hildegard saw them as complementary ways of exploring God's creation. She began compiling observations about herbs, illnesses, minerals, and the human body. Her writings eventually formed extensive works that modern historians regard as among the most important examples of medieval natural science. Unlike many scholars who relied solely on ancient authorities, Hildegard incorporated practical knowledge gathered from everyday life. Monastic communities often cared for the sick, and centuries of experience had produced traditions of herbal medicine. Hildegard combined this inherited wisdom with her own observations. She described the properties of plants and their possible uses. She discussed digestion, sleep, emotions, and physical health. Certain remedies she recommended reflected medieval misunderstandings, yet others reveal surprisingly careful observations. Above all, she emphasized balance and moderation. Health, she believed, involved harmony between body and soul. Food occupied an important place in her writings. She paid close attention to the effects of various grains, fruits, vegetables, and spices. Fennel, chestnuts, and spelt held particular significance in her recommendations. Moderation, rather than excess, appeared repeatedly throughout her teachings. Today, some enthusiasts continue to study and adapt aspects of Hildegard's medical philosophy, although modern medicine has naturally advanced far beyond medieval knowledge. Nevertheless, historians recognize her work as an impressive achievement for its time. Yet medicine represented only one aspect of her genius. Music occupied an equally important place in her world. For Hildegard, music reflected the harmony of heaven itself. She believed melodies possessed spiritual power capable of lifting the human soul closer to God. Unlike many compositions of the era, her music displayed remarkable originality. The soaring lines and unusual structures distinguished her works from those of her contemporaries. She composed dozens of chants and hymns, many dedicated to saints, the Virgin Mary, and divine virtues. Their beauty has captivated audiences for centuries. Within the convent, voices filled the air with song. Nuns gathered together beneath stone ceilings where candlelight danced across walls and manuscripts rested upon wooden stands. Their music echoed through corridors and chapels, transforming ordinary moments into acts of devotion. One of Hildegard's most extraordinary creations was a morality play known as Ordo Virtutum, or the Play of the Virtues. In this work, personified virtues confront the forces of evil while the human soul struggles between them. It stands among the earliest surviving musical dramas in history. Centuries later, scholars would recognize its importance not only as a religious work but also as a milestone in the development of Western theater and music. Her imagination seemed inexhaustible. Visions continued to inspire elaborate illustrations filled with cosmic imagery. Circles of fire, stars, radiant figures, and symbolic landscapes appeared throughout her manuscripts. These images conveyed profound theological ideas using vivid visual language. Modern observers have often marveled at their complexity. Some researchers have even suggested that certain aspects of Hildegard's visions resemble symptoms associated with migraines. Bright lights, geometric patterns, and unusual visual phenomena described in her writings have inspired scientific debate. Whether such explanations fully account for her experiences remains uncertain, and historians generally approach the subject with caution. For Hildegard herself, there was no doubt. The visions represented divine revelations. Regardless of their origin, they fueled one of the most extraordinary creative careers of the Middle Ages. As the years passed, the Abbess of Rupertsberg gained a reputation unlike any other woman of her era. She was simultaneously a spiritual leader, composer, healer, natural philosopher, writer, and advisor. Her convent prospered. Additional communities emerged under her influence, including another foundation at Eibingen across the Rhine. Yet perhaps the most astonishing development still lay ahead. In a time when women rarely traveled publicly to preach, Hildegard embarked upon journeys that defied expectations. Leaving the safety of her convent, she traveled across German lands delivering sermons to clergy and ordinary believers alike. Crowds gathered to hear her speak. Churches opened their doors. Monasteries welcomed her. Townspeople listened attentively as the famous abbess called for repentance and spiritual reform. Such preaching tours were virtually unprecedented for a woman. Roads remained difficult and dangerous. Travel required patience and endurance. Carts rattled across rough terrain. Rivers had to be crossed. Weather posed constant challenges. Nevertheless, Hildegard continued. People who encountered her often described a commanding presence combined with profound conviction. Though physically fragile at times, she possessed remarkable energy and determination. As she entered the later decades of her life, her reputation had grown far beyond anything imaginable during her childhood under Judah's care. Kings knew her name. Bishops respected her counsel. Scholars admired her writings. Pilgrims sought her blessings. And throughout the Holy Roman Empire, stories spread of the extraordinary abbess whose wisdom seemed to illuminate every field she touched. But age was advancing. New controversies awaited. And one final conflict would test Hildegard's courage more severely than ever before. Leaving behind the bustling churches and monasteries that had welcomed her during her remarkable preaching journeys, Hildegard eventually returned once more to the familiar slopes overlooking the Rhine, where the convent at Rupertsberg continued to flourish beneath her guidance, and although the years had brought increasing fame and responsibilities, the rhythms that governed life within the community remained much the same as they had when she first entered religious life as a child. Bells still called the sisters to prayer before dawn, candles still flickered in the darkness while chants echoed beneath stone ceilings, and the first light of morning still spread slowly across the vineyards and forests surrounding the river below, where barges loaded with wine and grain drifted steadily between distant towns, carrying merchants, pilgrims, and news from lands far beyond the valley. New generations of women continued arriving at Rupertsberg, many of them having heard stories about the famous abbess whose visions had received papal approval and whose letters had reached emperors and bishops, yet those who lived beside Hildegard knew that renown had never altered her devotion to ordinary duties, because despite her writings and reputation, she remained deeply concerned with the daily life of the convent itself, ensuring that gardens were maintained, manuscripts carefully preserved, and younger sisters instructed with patience and kindness. Age had begun to mark her face and slow her movements, but the strength of her spirit remained unchanged, and visitors who expected to encounter a distant and mysterious figure often found instead a woman whose wisdom seemed to grow naturally from humility and experience. Letters continued to arrive with astonishing regularity, carried along roads that crossed mountains and rivers, each one bearing the concerns of people separated by great distances but united by the hope that Hildegard might offer guidance. Noblewomen troubled by disputes within their families sought her prayers and counsel. Abbots overseeing communities of monks requested advice concerning discipline and spiritual life. Priests burdened by doubts confided their fears to her. Bishops responsible for entire dioceses asked for her opinions on difficult matters, and rulers whose decisions affected thousands sometimes looked toward the abbess of Bingen for words of encouragement or warning. Although she had never desired such influence, she accepted these requests as responsibilities rather than honors, believing that wisdom carried obligations that could not be ignored. By this stage of her life, she had witnessed much of the turbulent 12th century unfold before her eyes. She had seen emperors struggle against popes, watched rival claimants divide loyalties throughout Christendom, and listened as reports of wars and conflicts reached the peaceful surroundings of her convent. She had observed how prosperity transformed some regions while famine and hardship afflicted others. Pilgrims had shared stories of distant kingdoms, and merchants arriving along the Rhine brought news of changing fortunes across Europe. Through all these developments, Hildegard remained convinced that humanity formed part of a divine order that required balance, justice, and humility, virtues she believed were too often forgotten by those who sought power above all else. Across the Rhine, the community at Eibingen also prospered under her care, and although advancing age made travel increasingly difficult, Hildegard continued to concern herself with both convents. The sisters looked to her not merely as an abbess but as a mother and teacher whose presence shaped every aspect of their lives. Younger women who had never known Jutta or the earliest years at Disibodenberg listened with fascination to stories about the hardships that had accompanied the foundation of Rupertsberg and the struggles that had once seemed impossible to overcome. To them, Hildegard's achievements appeared almost legendary, yet she spoke of the past not with pride but with gratitude, remembering how uncertain every stage of her journey had seemed when she first confronted it. The manuscripts created under her supervision multiplied over the years. Scribes bent over wooden desks copying texts with patient precision while sunlight filtered through narrow windows and the sounds of birds drifted in from the gardens outside. Ink and parchment transformed thoughts into enduring records, preserving visions, hymns, medical observations, and countless letters that would outlive everyone who handled them. None of those working quietly within the convent could know how valuable these writings would become centuries later, but they understood that preserving knowledge itself formed part of their sacred duties. Music continued to occupy a central place within Hildegard's understanding of creation. To her, harmony reflected the order established by God, and every chant sung by the sisters represented participation in something far greater than themselves. The melodies she had composed over many decades remained woven into the fabric of convent life. Voices rising together in prayer accompanied the passing seasons, marking feast days and ordinary mornings alike, and even as age weakened her body, Hildegard never lost her love for music or her belief that song possessed the power to elevate the soul. Yet despite the peace that surrounded Rupertsberg, events would soon arise that tested her resolve one final time. A nobleman who had once fallen under the punishment of excommunication approached the end of his life, and according to Hildegard's understanding, reconciliation with the Church had been achieved before his death. Convinced that mercy had prevailed, she permitted the man to be buried in the cemetery belonging to the convent, believing that denying him Christian burial would contradict both justice and compassion. Others viewed the matter differently, and before long church authorities challenged her decision, insisting that the body should be removed from consecrated ground. The demand struck Hildegard deeply. She believed firmly that disturbing the grave would violate principles she could not abandon, and despite her advanced age and physical weakness, she refused to comply. Officials responsible for enforcing ecclesiastical discipline regarded her resistance as unacceptable, and tensions quickly intensified. Arguments were exchanged, appeals were made, and what might have seemed a minor dispute grew into a conflict with painful consequences for the convent. Among the penalties imposed upon the community, none affected Hildegard more profoundly than restrictions placed upon certain forms of sacred music. For a woman who regarded harmony as a reflection of heaven itself, silence carried a sorrow beyond words. The voices that had filled the chapel for generations suddenly faced limitations that transformed the atmosphere of worship. To younger sisters, the punishment seemed heartbreaking, but Hildegard remained steadfast, convinced that truth and mercy stood on her side. Although weakened by age, she defended her position with the same determination that had once carried her from Disibodenberg to Rupertsberg and had sustained her through decades of challenges. Letters flowed once more from her hand as she explained the reasons behind her decision and appealed to higher authorities for justice. Those who encountered the elderly abbess during these years discovered that neither time nor illness had diminished the courage that had defined her entire life. Her words retained their clarity, and her convictions remained unshaken. Eventually, after much debate and examination, the restrictions were lifted, and once again the voices of the sisters rose freely in song. Relief spread throughout the community, and for Hildegard the restoration of music represented not simply the end of a dispute but the reaffirmation of something she had cherished since childhood. Harmony returned to the chapel, and chants once more echoed beneath the stone arches of Rupertsberg while the waters of the Rhine continued their endless journey toward distant seas. By then the years weighed heavily upon her. She had lived far longer than many of her contemporaries, reaching an age that few people in the Middle Ages could expect to attain. Her movements became slower, and periods of illness occurred with increasing frequency, but her mind remained active, and those closest to her continued seeking advice and encouragement. The younger sisters recognized that they were witnessing the final chapter of a remarkable life, though none could know precisely when that chapter would end. Outside the convent walls, Europe moved steadily onward. Children were born who would never know the names of rulers who had once seemed invincible. Old conflicts gave way to new struggles. Markets expanded, castles rose, and cities continued to grow. Travelers passed along roads that had carried countless generations before them, scarcely aware that within the convent above the Rhine lived a woman whose writings and music would endure long after kingdoms themselves had changed beyond recognition. And as another autumn approached in the year 1179, with vineyards heavy with fruit and cool winds beginning to sweep across the Rhine valley, the extraordinary journey that had begun more than 8 decades earlier was quietly drawing toward its conclusion, though daily life within the convent continued with the familiar rhythms that had shaped so much of Hildegard's existence. The bells still announced the hours of prayer, the sisters still gathered before dawn beneath the glow of candles, and the chants that had once been threatened with silence now rose freely again, filling the chapel with melodies that Hildegard herself had composed over many years. For those who shared her life, these sounds had become inseparable from the woman who had taught them to see music not merely as ornament or ritual but as a reflection of the harmony woven into creation itself. The elderly abbess spent more time resting than she once had, yet periods of weakness never entirely separated her from the responsibilities she had carried for so long. Younger sisters often entered her chamber seeking advice concerning spiritual matters, and visitors arriving from distant regions still hoped for the opportunity to receive a blessing or hear words of encouragement. Some had traveled for weeks, crossing rivers and forests simply to meet the famous abbess whose reputation had spread throughout Christendom, and although age limited her strength, she continued to receive them whenever possible, recognizing in their journeys a sincere desire for comfort and guidance. Those who sat beside her during these final years encountered not a figure consumed by thoughts of fame or achievements but a woman whose mind remained fixed upon the mysteries that had accompanied her since childhood. The visions that had once frightened the young girl at Disibodenberg had shaped every stage of her life, and even now she spoke of divine light and heavenly harmony with the same conviction that had sustained her through decades of challenges. To Hildegard, the wonders she had witnessed throughout her life were never reasons for pride. They represented responsibilities entrusted to her, gifts intended to inspire faith and understanding rather than admiration for herself. Outside the convent, the world continued to change with little regard for the passing of individual lives. Merchants guided their vessels along the Rhine. Farmers gathered their harvests before the arrival of winter. Noblemen pursued ambitions and settled disputes. Bishops attended councils and rulers negotiated alliances. News traveled slowly but constantly, carried by riders and pilgrims whose stories linked distant regions together. Generations succeeded one another with such regularity that events once considered momentous gradually faded into memory, yet within the quiet walls of Rupertsberg, the sisters sensed that they were living beside someone whose influence extended far beyond their own age. As autumn deepened, the forests surrounding the convent began displaying shades of gold and crimson. Morning mists lingered longer over the river, and cooler winds swept across the vineyards that covered the hillsides. The changing seasons had accompanied Hildegard throughout her entire life. She had witnessed countless springs and winters, and each passing year had reinforced her belief that nature itself reflected a divine order beyond human understanding. Even during illness, she found comfort in observing the cycles that govern creation, seeing in them reminders that endings and beginnings formed part of the same design. By September, her strength had diminished considerably. Those closest to her understood that the end might be near, though no one could predict precisely when it would come. The sisters prayed constantly, surrounding their abbess with the devotion and gratitude that decades of leadership had inspired. Many of them had entered religious life under her guidance. Others had known no other abbess. For them, Hildegard's presence had become inseparable from the identity of the convent itself. When news spread that her health had worsened, concern extended far beyond Rupertsberg. Clergymen, nobles, and ordinary believers who had benefited from her advice remembered the countless letters she had written and the wisdom she had shared. The woman who had once corresponded with emperors and admonished bishops now faced the same reality that awaited every king, peasant, scholar, and laborer. No earthly authority could prevent the passage of time. In the days that followed, prayers continued almost without interruption. Candles burned softly in the chapel. Familiar hymns filled the air. Outside, the river flowed onward as it had long before Hildegard's birth and would continue to do long after her passing. The sisters attending her remained aware that they were witnessing the conclusion of a life unlike any they would ever see again. Then, in September of 1179, after more than 80 years spent in a world often marked by violence, uncertainty, and hardship, Hildegard of Bingen died peacefully, leaving behind a community shaped by her leadership and a legacy whose full significance no one present could possibly comprehend. Grief spread throughout the convent. The woman who had guided generations, composed music that seemed to capture the beauty of heaven, and written books that explored everything from theology to medicine had departed from the world she had studied with such wonder. Those who loved her naturally sought ways to express the extraordinary respect they felt. Stories soon emerged describing unusual lights in the heavens at the time of her death. Whether these accounts reflected historical events or the affectionate memories of grieving followers, they revealed the profound impression she had made upon those around her. To many, it seemed impossible that such a life could end without signs worthy of remembrance. The sisters of Rupertsberg preserved her writings with special care. Manuscripts that had occupied countless hours of labor remained safely stored within the convent. Letters exchanged with powerful rulers and humble believers alike survived among their collections. The chants she had composed continued to be sung, ensuring that her voice would not vanish completely with her passing. Those who had known her personally shared memories with younger generations, and stories about the remarkable abbess spread gradually through monasteries and churches across the German lands. Yet history rarely moves in straight lines. Centuries passed, and Europe experienced transformations that no one in the 12th century could have imagined. The Crusades continued. Kingdoms rose and disappeared. Cathedrals reached toward the heavens. New universities emerged. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical learning. Religious divisions reshaped entire nations. Wars devastated regions that had once enjoyed peace, and the world that Hildegard had known slowly disappeared into the distance of memory. Even the convent at Rupertsberg could not escape the passage of time. Generations of nuns came and went. Buildings weathered storms and changing fortunes. Eventually, destruction overtook the site that Hildegard had fought so hard to establish. Walls crumbled, and traces of the original foundation faded. Travelers passing through the Rhine Valley might have remained unaware that one of the Middle Age's most extraordinary women had once lived there. Yet the manuscripts endured. Hidden within libraries and archives, protected by scholars and religious communities, her writings survived the centuries. Long after the voices that had copied them fell silent, the pages themselves remained, waiting patiently for new generations to rediscover them. Historians studying medieval spirituality encountered her visions. Music scholars examining ancient manuscripts found melodies unlike any others composed during her age. Researchers interested in medicine and natural philosophy discovered observations that revealed the remarkable curiosity of a 12th-century abbess whose interests seemed almost limitless. Gradually, Hildegard emerged from the shadows of history. People who expected to find only a medieval mystic encountered instead a woman who had written about plants and gemstones, composed music of haunting beauty, founded convents, traveled publicly to preach, advised rulers, and challenged powerful authorities whenever conscience demanded it. The deeper scholars explored her life, the more astonishing her achievements appeared. Few figures of the Middle Ages had left behind such a wide range of works, and fewer still had done so while overcoming the limitations placed upon women during that era. Her music found new audiences. Choirs once again performed melodies that had first echoed beneath the stone ceilings of Rupertsberg. Historians translated her writings. Artists admired the striking images preserved within her manuscripts. Pilgrims and travelers visited the Rhine Valley searching for traces of the places she had known. The woman whose name might once have faded into obscurity became increasingly recognized as one of the most extraordinary minds of medieval Europe. And nearly 8 centuries after her death, official recognition arrived in a form that would have seemed unimaginable to the shy child who had once entered religious life at Disibodenberg. In 2012, Pope Benedict XVI declared Hildegard of Bingen a Doctor of the Church, an honor reserved for individuals whose teachings have profoundly influenced Christian thought. Only a small number of people throughout history have received such recognition, and among them women remain especially rare. Thus the voice that had first spoken through visions seen by a frightened young girl continued to echo across 9 centuries. The melodies composed beside the Rhine continued to be heard. The books written by candlelight continued to be studied. And the life of Hildegard of Bingen stood as a reminder that greatness often appears where few expect to find it, emerging quietly from places devoted not to power or wealth, but to faith, curiosity, and the endless desire to understand the wonders of creation that surround humanity in every age.